The long struggle between Rome and the peoples of Gaul began with one of the darkest moments in Roman memory. Gallic warriors swept into Italy, defeated Roman resistance, entered the city itself, and set much of Rome ablaze. Only the fortified capital remained beyond their control. The disaster left a lasting impression on Roman society, but it did not end with permanent Gallic domination. Marcus Furius Camillus eventually emerged as the central figure in Rome's recovery, driving the invaders away and becoming closely associated with the restoration of the city. The danger returned years later. Another Gallic invasion pushed south into Roman territory, and once again Camillus was called upon to confront it. Despite his advanced age, he defeated the attackers and was rewarded with a triumph. According to the tradition preserved in the account, he was already 81 years old. A third major Gallic force later entered Italy, only to meet another Roman army under Titus Quinctius. This expedition ended disastrously for the invaders as well, reinforcing the growing impression that Rome had learned how to survive and defeat the northern armies that had once terrified it. Among the Gallic peoples who continued to challenge Rome were the Boii, remembered as particularly fierce opponents. When they advanced against Roman territory, the dictator Gaius Sulpicius prepared an unusual battlefield tactic. Instead of ordering the entire army to throw its weapons simultaneously, he arranged the attack in stages. The soldiers in the first line hurled their javelins and immediately lowered themselves. The ranks behind them then repeated the action one after another, allowing a continuous storm of missiles to pass over the crouching men in front. Once the final rank had thrown its weapons, the entire Roman formation rose together and rushed forward with a loud battle cry. The purpose was psychological as much as physical. The enemy would first be struck by repeated waves of missiles and then, before having time to recover, face a sudden massed assault. The tactic proved devastating. The Boii were overwhelmed, and their army was effectively destroyed. Their own weapons were described as heavy spears resembling Roman pila, constructed partly from wood and partly from iron, with the metal remaining relatively soft except near the sharpened point. The conflict did not end there. Other Gallic armies continued to appear, and Roman commanders repeatedly fought them across Italy. Popilius defeated one such force, while a later Camillus, the son of the famous commander associated with Rome's recovery, also gained a victory against them. Generations afterward, Aemilius Pappus added further Roman successes. What had begun as a terrifying invasion of Roman territory gradually developed into a recurring military contest in which Rome became increasingly capable of meeting Gallic armies on equal or superior terms. An even greater threat appeared shortly before the age of Gaius Marius. Enormous groups of Celtic warriors moved through Gaul and toward Italy, bringing with them a reputation for extraordinary physical strength and ferocity. Roman armies sent against them suffered severe defeats, and several commanders were unable to stop their advance. The situation became serious enough for Marius to receive command. His campaigns reversed the crisis. The invading forces were ultimately crushed, turning what had seemed like another potentially catastrophic invasion into one of the great military successes associated with his career. Yet the largest Roman confrontation with the peoples of Gaul came later, during the campaigns of Julius Caesar. Over roughly a decade of warfare, Caesar and his commanders fought across an enormous region against numerous tribes, coalitions, and migrating populations. Ancient accounts describe the scale in dramatic terms, claiming that millions became involved in the conflict, with vast numbers killed or captured. Hundreds of communities and many hundreds of settlements were said to have fallen under Roman authority, whether through direct conquest or through the suppression of revolts. Roman tradition also remembered spectacular victories from the period before Marius and Caesar. Fabius Maximus Aemilianus was credited with defeating an immense Gallic army, despite commanding a much smaller Roman force. Ancient figures claim that approximately 120,000 enemies died while Roman casualties were almost unbelievably low. Even more striking was the story that Fabius entered the battle while still suffering from a recent wound. At times, he was carried through the ranks on a litter, while at others he struggled forward on foot with assistance, encouraging his soldiers and instructing them in how to withstand the aggressive fighting style of their opponents. When Caesar began his own northern campaigns, one of his earliest major confrontations involved the Helvetii and their allies. Their migration had brought a huge population into motion, creating both a political and military problem for Rome. Among them were the Tigurini, a group with an especially painful place in Roman memory. Years earlier, they had defeated a Roman army led by Piso and Cassius and forced captured Romans to pass beneath the yoke, a ritual humiliation symbolizing submission. Caesar now had an opportunity to reverse that humiliation. His lieutenant Labienus defeated the Tigurini, while Caesar himself confronted the remaining forces and their supporters. The victory was more than a local battlefield success. It allowed Roman writers to present the campaign as repayment for an older disgrace, transforming a previous defeat into another example of Rome's ability to recover from disaster and eventually punish those who had once defeated it. Soon afterward, Caesar faced Ariovistus and his Germanic warriors. Ancient descriptions portray these fighters as physically imposing, fearless, and hardened by difficult conditions. They were believed to tolerate extreme cold and heat, survive on limited food, and face death without hesitation. Their reputation made them intimidating. Enemies, and their initial assault demonstrated why. The Germans charged with tremendous force and drove the Roman legions backward. The Roman formation, however, did not collapse. The soldiers maintained their organization, absorbed the pressure, and gradually turned the battle through discipline and coordinated movement. In the ancient account, this contrast becomes central to the explanation of Roman victory. The Germans are portrayed as fighting with tremendous passion and raw courage, while the Romans combine courage with training, endurance, and tactical control. Once the initial momentum of the German attack faded, the Roman legions gained the advantage and inflicted enormous losses on Ariovistus's forces. Caesar then turned his attention toward the Belgae, whose resistance became another major phase of the conquest. During one encounter, Roman forces attacked while part of the enemy was attempting to cross a river. The slaughter was described in deliberately dramatic language, with the dead supposedly becoming so numerous that they seemed to fill the water itself. Such descriptions were designed to emphasize both the violence of the campaign and the overwhelming scale of Roman victory. But Caesar's advance was far from effortless. The Nervi nearly brought his army to catastrophe. They attacked with remarkable speed while the Romans were still establishing their camp after a march. The sudden assault gave Caesar little time to organize a conventional battle line. Roman officers suffered heavily, and the situation became so dangerous that Caesar himself had to become directly involved in the fighting, while parts of his army struggled simply to survive. For a time, the Nervi appeared close to achieving an extraordinary victory. Caesar withdrew to a defensible position with the troops around him while the enemy pressed the attack. The arrival and intervention of the 10th Legion helped transform the situation. Struck from another direction and increasingly surrounded, the Nervi lost the advantage created by their surprise assault. Their force, traditionally numbered at around 60,000, was devastated. The battle became one of the clearest examples of how quickly Caesar's campaigns could shift from near disaster to decisive victory. Roman operations continued against numerous other peoples. The Allobroges were brought under control, while the Usipetes and Tencteri suffered a particularly brutal fate. Ancient accounts give an enormous figure for those killed, including both fighters and non-combatants. Whether or not such numbers should be taken literally, the description reveals the extraordinary level of violence that Roman authors associated with Caesar's northern wars. Not every encounter favored Rome. A small force of Sygambrian cavalry once surprised a much larger body of Caesar's horsemen and sent them fleeing. It was an embarrassing reversal, especially because the Romans possessed such a large numerical advantage. Yet, as so often happens in these narratives, the setback was followed by retaliation. The Sugambri were eventually defeated, allowing Roman authors to present the incident as another temporary humiliation that was ultimately answered by Roman military power. Caesar's ambitions soon carried Roman warfare beyond familiar frontiers. He became the first Roman commander to lead an army across the Rhine, a river that represented not merely a geographical obstacle, but an important psychological boundary between Roman-controlled territories and the lands farther east. Crossing it demonstrated that Rome was no longer content simply to defend Gaul. Roman armies could now carry war directly into regions from which earlier threats had emerged. His expeditions to Britain pushed that ambition even farther. To Roman audiences, Britain remained distant, mysterious, and only imperfectly understood. Caesar's decision to cross the sea therefore possessed enormous symbolic importance. The campaign carried Roman soldiers beyond the continental world in which most previous Western wars had been fought, and into an island that many Romans knew largely through rumor and geography. The crossing itself was remembered as a difficult operation shaped by unfamiliar maritime conditions. Caesar used the movement of the tides to assist his fleet, allowing the changing sea to carry the ships toward the British coast. The current began gently, but increased in strength until the fleet moved rapidly across the water. In this way, the campaigns that had begun with conflicts against migrating peoples in Gaul eventually carried Roman arms across great rivers and open sea, marking a dramatic expansion of Rome's military reach into the far northwestern edges of the known world. During the period identified by Greek chronology as the 97th Olympiad, large numbers of Gauls living around both sides of the Rhine began searching for new territory. Their existing lands could no longer support their growing population, and migration became an increasingly attractive solution. Moving southward, they crossed the Alps and entered the region around Clusium, one of the fertile areas of Etruria. Clusium had recently formed friendly relations with Rome, so its inhabitants appealed to the Romans for assistance. Rome responded by sending 3 members of the powerful Fabian family as envoys. Their official mission was diplomatic. They were to tell the Gauls to leave territory belonging to a Roman ally and warn them that refusal could have consequences. The Gauls were unimpressed. They answered that Roman threats meant little to them, that they had come because they needed land, and that they had so far made no hostile move against Rome itself. At this point, however, the situation changed dramatically. Instead of remaining neutral as ambassadors were expected to do, the Fabii encouraged the people of Clusium to attack the Gauls, while many of them were scattered through the countryside gathering supplies. Even more seriously, the Roman envoys personally joined the fighting. The surprise attack killed many Gallic warriors who had been caught away from their main force. Quintus Fabius distinguished himself during the clash by killing a Gallic leader with his own hands. He then stripped the fallen man of his weapons and carried them back to Clusium as trophies. For the Gauls, this was not simply an act of violence, it was a violation of the accepted rules of diplomacy. Brennus, their king, regarded the participation of official Roman ambassadors in battle as an insult that demanded an answer. When Rome later attempted to send another delegation, Brennus refused to deal with it in the usual manner and instead prepared his own diplomatic challenge. To make an impression on the Romans, Brennus selected several exceptionally large warriors to serve as envoys. The Gauls already had a reputation for unusual height and physical strength, and these men were said to stand out even among their own people. Their appearance was intended to send a message before negotiations even began. When they arrived in Rome, the envoys formally accused the Fabii of breaking the laws that protected diplomatic representatives. Men sent as ambassadors had taken up weapons and fought against those with whom they were supposed to negotiate. Brennus therefore demanded that the Fabii be surrendered for punishment. Otherwise, he argued, Rome itself would effectively accept responsibility for what they had done. The Roman authorities admitted that the Fabii had acted improperly. Yet the family was too influential to punish easily. Instead, the Romans attempted to settle the dispute by offering financial compensation. The Gallic representatives rejected the proposal. Rather than disciplining the Fabii, Rome then elected them as military tribunes for the following year. This decision enraged Brennus and his followers. From their perspective, Rome had not merely failed to punish men who had broken diplomatic law, it had rewarded them with public office. When the Gallic envoys were told that nothing could now be done because the Fabii were magistrates, and that they should return the following year if they were still dissatisfied, the insult became even greater. Brennus responded by calling upon neighboring Gallic groups to join him. Messengers were sent through the surrounding regions, urging other warriors to unite in a common campaign against Rome. Large numbers answered the call. Once the combined force had assembled, the Gauls abandoned their camp and began the march toward the Roman capital. As the crisis deepened, communication between Roman forces became extremely dangerous. A man named Caedicius is remembered for volunteering to pass through enemy-held territory in order to carry messages to the defenders on the capital. Rome itself had already fallen into desperate circumstances, and reaching the fortified hill meant moving through areas occupied by the enemy. Another important message concerned Marcus Furius Camillus. He had previously been driven into exile following political conflict, but the catastrophe facing Rome changed attitudes toward him. The Senate now wanted him restored to authority and called upon him to lead the recovery of the state. When the decree appointing him was brought to him, Camillus was urged not to allow resentment over his earlier treatment to interfere with his duty. Rome had wronged him, but Rome now needed him. His response presented him as placing the survival of the Republic above personal revenge. Rather than taking satisfaction in the fact that those who had rejected him were now desperate for his return, he expressed the hope that he might perform a service great enough to match the scale of Rome's disaster. Meanwhile, the Gauls had still failed to capture the capital. Unable to force their way up its defenses, they adopted a different strategy and waited below, hoping hunger would eventually compel the Romans to surrender. The siege therefore became a struggle of endurance rather than a series of direct attacks. During this tense period, a Roman priest named Dorso became associated with one of the most striking stories of the siege. A religious ceremony had to be performed according to its traditional annual schedule, even though the city was occupied. Dorso therefore left the safety of the capital, carrying the sacred objects required for the ritual, and proceeded toward the temple where the sacrifice was supposed to take place. He passed directly through areas controlled by the Gauls. Yet they did not kill him. Ancient tradition offers two possible explanations. Perhaps they were astonished by his extraordinary courage, or perhaps they respected the obvious sacred nature of his mission. Whatever the reason, Dorso was allowed to continue. His devotion to his religious duty had exposed him to mortal danger, but that same visible devotion may also have protected him. Roman writers also preserved a very different image of the Gallic army during its occupation of the city. According to this tradition, the Gauls indulged heavily in wine and food once they gained access to Roman supplies. Coming from regions that Roman authors described as comparatively limited in agricultural variety, they supposedly surrendered themselves enthusiastically to unfamiliar luxuries. The account uses this behavior to explain a physical weakness that Roman authors believed existed beneath the terrifying appearance of Gallic warriors. They were described as large and imposing, but also as increasingly heavy and poorly suited to prolonged exertion after excessive eating and drinking. Their bodies, according to this hostile portrayal, quickly became exhausted during sustained activity. Camillus supposedly exploited exactly this psychological contrast. Before confronting the Gauls, he attempted to destroy the fear that their appearance inspired among Roman soldiers. Gallic warriors were famous for their loud battle cries, long swords, wild hair, and dramatic displays before combat. To men who had already seen Rome captured, such an enemy could seem almost unstoppable. Camillus therefore presented captured or exposed Gauls to his troops and urged them to look beyond the noise and spectacle. These were not supernatural enemies, he argued, but ordinary men with physical limitations. Their shouting, weapons, and intimidating appearance should not distract the Romans from the fact that disciplined soldiers could defeat them. During the fighting that followed, Roman forces were able to benefit from continuous reinforcement. Those watching from the city walls could observe the progress of the battle, and fresh soldiers were repeatedly sent forward to replace men who had become tired. The Gauls did not have the same advantage. As the struggle continued, exhausted Gallic warriors were repeatedly forced to face opponents who had entered the battle rested. Gradually, their formation began to weaken. Once discipline disappeared, retreat became increasingly chaotic, and the Gauls eventually broke into disorderly flight. In the Roman telling, endurance and organization once again proved stronger than physical intimidation. Another episode from the wars with the Gauls centered on a single combat involving the Roman warrior Valerius. His Gallic opponent fought with great fury and continued pursuing him even after suffering serious blood loss. Valerius avoided being drawn immediately into close contact, instead retreating steadily and forcing the wounded man to keep following. Eventually, exhaustion and loss of blood overcame the Gaul. He collapsed while still attempting to reach Valerius, bringing the duel to an end. Roman tradition celebrated the encounter as another symbolic individual victory over the Gauls, adding it to earlier stories in which Roman champions had faced physically imposing Celtic warriors in single combat. Hostility between Rome and Gallic peoples continued for generations. One particularly violent conflict involved the Senones. Although they had entered into a treaty with Rome, they later supplied mercenary soldiers to Rome's enemies. The Senate considered this a breach of their agreement and sent ambassadors to protest. Among the Senones was a leader named Britomaris. He had a personal reason to hate Rome. His father had previously died while fighting alongside the Etruscans against Roman forces. When the Roman envoys arrived, Britomaris allowed anger and revenge to override the protections normally granted to diplomats. The ambassadors carried the staff that identified their sacred diplomatic status and wore the clothing associated with their office. Nevertheless, Britomaris ordered them killed. The brutality did not stop with their deaths. Their bodies were cut into pieces and scattered across the countryside, turning the murder into an intentional act of humiliation as well as violence. News of the killing reached the consul Cornelius while he was already campaigning. His reaction was immediate. He redirected his army and moved rapidly through the Sabine region and Picenum toward the territory of the Senones. The Roman response was not designed simply to win a battle. It was intended as total punishment. Senonian settlements were attacked systematically. Roman troops burned communities, destroyed property, and killed the adult male population on a massive scale. Women and children were enslaved. The land itself was devastated so thoroughly that ancient writers claimed Rome intended to make the territory impossible for the Senones to inhabit again. Britomaris received special treatment. Instead of being killed during the campaign, he was captured alive so that punishment could be inflicted upon him personally. His role in the murder of Roman ambassadors made him more valuable as a prisoner than as another casualty on the battlefield. The surviving Senones soon found themselves in a hopeless position. Their settlements had been destroyed, their families scattered or enslaved, and their territory ruined. With no secure homeland to which they could retreat, they made another desperate attack, this time against the consul Domitius. The effort failed. Defeated again and facing a future without homes or security, many of the remaining Senones chose death rather than survival after the destruction of their people. Roman accounts presented their fate as the final consequence of violating the sacred protection of ambassadors. The episode therefore became more than another chapter in Rome's wars with the Gauls. It was remembered as a warning that an attack upon Roman envoys could bring punishment not merely upon the individuals responsible, but upon an entire community. After Rome defeated the Salii, several of their leading chiefs escaped, and sought protection among the Allobroges. Rome demanded that these fugitives be handed over, but the Allobroges refused. Their decision transformed a diplomatic dispute into open conflict, and the Romans prepared for war under the command of Gnaeus Domitius. As Domitius advanced through the former territory of the Salii, he was approached by an envoy sent by Bituitus, king of the Allobroges. The ambassador arrived in impressive style, dressed in rich clothing, and surrounded by an equally elaborate group of attendants. Even his escort reflected the customs of the region, as trained dogs accompanied the delegation and served as additional guards. The procession also included a musician, whose role was far more than simple entertainment. In the manner of his people, he sang praises first of King Bituitus, then of the Allobroges as a whole, and finally of the ambassador himself. The song celebrated the envoy's noble ancestry, military courage, and wealth, turning the diplomatic mission into a public display of status and prestige. Such performers were apparently a familiar part of important embassies, especially when prominent men wanted their reputation and achievements announced before negotiations even began. The ambassador therefore approached Domitius not only as a political representative, but as a figure surrounded by symbols of rank, wealth, and honor. Yet the impressive display achieved little. The envoy pleaded with the Roman commander to forgive and protect the Salian chiefs who had taken refuge among the Allobroges, but Domitius refused to change Rome's position. The request failed, and diplomacy could no longer prevent the confrontation that followed. A large force of Teutones eventually entered the region of Noricum in search of plunder. Their movement immediately alarmed Rome. The consul Papirius Carbo feared that the invaders might continue southward into Italy, so he positioned his army in the Alps, guarding one of the narrowest passages through which they might attempt to cross. The Teutons, however, made no immediate move toward Italy. Rather than remaining in his defensive position, Carbo decided to advance against them. He justified his action by arguing that they had entered the territory of Noricum, whose people enjoyed a recognized friendship with Rome. This relationship was not quite the same as a formal military alliance. The Romans often granted the status of friendship to foreign communities when they wished to reserve the right to intervene on their behalf, without assuming all the obligations that came with an official alliance. As the Roman army approached, the Teutones sent representatives to Carbo. They claimed that they had been unaware of Noricum's special relationship with Rome and promised that they would cause no further trouble there. On the surface, Carbo accepted their explanation. He praised the envoys and even provided guides who were supposedly meant to lead them safely back toward their own people. Behind this appearance of goodwill, however, Carbo had prepared an ambush. He secretly instructed the guides to take the Teutonic representatives along a longer route, while he moved rapidly by a shorter path with his army. His intention was to reach the main Teutonic force before the returning envoys could warn them. The plan initially worked. Carbo arrived while many of the Teutones were still resting and launched a surprise attack. Yet the betrayal soon turned against him. The Teutones recovered from the shock, resisted fiercely, and inflicted devastating losses on the Romans. Instead of achieving an easy victory, Carbo found his army close to complete destruction. The Romans may have escaped annihilation only because the battle was interrupted by extraordinary weather. Darkness descended while a violent thunderstorm broke over the battlefield. The noise and confusion were so intense that both armies became separated, and the fighting stopped. Ancient tradition treated the storm almost as a direct intervention from the heavens. Even then, the Roman survivors were scattered. Small groups fled into the surrounding forests and struggled to find one another again. Only after several days did significant numbers finally regroup. The defeat was humiliating, and the Teutons were able to continue their movement toward Gaul. During these northern wars, the bodies of fallen Cimbri could also become objects of Roman interest. On one occasion, instructions were reportedly given that their corpses should remain untouched until daylight. The expectation was that many of the dead warriors would be carrying valuable ornaments, particularly gold, and that these could be collected more carefully once visibility improved. Later, another major migration threatened Roman interests in Gaul. The Tigurini and the Helvetii began moving into territory under Roman control. When Julius Caesar learned of their advance, he acted quickly to prevent them from passing freely through the province. One of his first measures was to construct an extensive defensive barrier along the Rhone. Stretching for a considerable distance, the fortification was intended to block the migrants and force them either to negotiate or to search for another route. The Helvetii sent representatives to Caesar in the hope of reaching an agreement. Caesar responded by demanding hostages and money as guarantees of their behavior. Their answer was deliberately defiant. They declared that their people were accustomed to receiving such concessions from others, not surrendering them themselves. Caesar also wanted to prevent the different migrating groups from combining their forces. He therefore divided his response. His lieutenant Labienus was sent against the Tigurini, considered the weaker of the two groups, while Caesar himself moved toward the Helvetii with Roman troops and thousands of Gallic mountain fighters serving alongside him. Labienus encountered the Tigurini near a river and caught them by surprise. They were defeated before they could organize an effective resistance, and much of their force scattered in confusion. The victory removed one immediate threat and prevented them from reinforcing the larger Helvetian movement. Another dangerous figure in Gaul was Ariovistus, king of a Germanic people from beyond the Rhine. Before Caesar had established himself fully in the region, Ariovistus crossed the river and began making war upon the Aedui, a people who maintained friendly relations with Rome. Roman authorities ordered Ariovistus to stop attacking them. At first he complied, withdrawing from direct pressure against the Aedui. He also sought formal recognition as a friend of the Roman people, a prestigious diplomatic status that could strengthen his political position. Rome accepted his request, and Caesar himself, while serving as consul, supported the decision. The relationship soon deteriorated. Ariovistus later met Caesar personally for negotiations, but after their first discussion he requested another meeting. Caesar declined to attend in person and instead sent several prominent Gallic representatives to speak with him. Ariovistus responded by arresting them and placing them in chains. This transformed the dispute from a tense diplomatic disagreement into a direct challenge. Caesar issued threats and began moving his army against the German king. The reputation of the Germans, however, caused serious anxiety within the Roman camp. Reports of their size, courage, and battlefield experience had spread widely, and many soldiers feared that they were about to confront an enemy unlike those they had previously faced. Before Caesar could defeat Ariovistus, he first had to overcome the fear developing inside his own army. Another controversial episode involved the Usipetes and Tencteri, two Germanic peoples who had been displaced from their former lands. Ancient accounts disagree sharply over what happened next, but the result was one of the bloodiest incidents associated with Caesar's campaigns. According to one version, approximately 800 German cavalry attacked a much larger Roman cavalry force without warning and managed to drive thousands of Roman horsemen from the field. Afterward, German ambassadors came to negotiate, but Caesar detained them rather than allowing the diplomatic process to continue normally. He then launched a sudden assault against the German population. Ancient sources claim that an enormous number of people were killed, including not only warriors, but many others caught in the destruction of the camp. The reported total reached hundreds of thousands, though such figures in ancient accounts were often intended to emphasize the scale of victory rather than provide a precise census of the dead. The episode became controversial even in Rome. One tradition states that Cato argued before the Senate that Caesar should actually be handed over to the surviving Germans as punishment. From this perspective, Caesar had violated the sacred protections of negotiation by attacking while diplomatic discussions were still underway. Caesar naturally presented events differently. In his own account, the Usipetes and Tencteri had been ordered to return to the lands from which they had come. They replied that they could not yet do so, because they had sent envoys to the Suebi, the people who had originally driven them out, and were still waiting for a response. While those discussions continued, according to Caesar, their cavalry unexpectedly attacked the Romans. A force of only a few hundred German horsemen succeeded in throwing several thousand Roman cavalry into confusion. When another embassy later arrived to explain what had happened, Caesar suspected that the negotiations were simply being used to gain more time. Rather than risk another surprise, he decided to attack before giving them a formal answer. The same event could therefore be interpreted in two completely different ways. Caesar's critics saw an attack carried out during negotiations, while Caesar portrayed himself as responding to an enemy that had already broken faith first. Tensions also followed Caesar across the sea into Britain. After agreements had been reached with some of the Britons, complaints emerged that Roman troops remained present despite the existence of a treaty. These grievances were used to encourage renewed resistance, with British leaders arguing that Roman military occupation contradicted the promises that had supposedly been made. Elsewhere, Caesar was forced to react rapidly when he learned that Quintus Cicero was in danger of attack. Rather than continue along his existing route, he turned his army back in order to respond to the threat, demonstrating how quickly the situation in Gaul could change from one region to another. Roman control also depended heavily on maintaining the loyalty of Gallic communities, particularly powerful peoples such as the Aedui. At one point, figures identified as Britores succeeded in drawing the Aedui away from their allegiance to Rome. When Caesar confronted them over this change of loyalty, their defense rested on history rather than immediate politics. They argued that an older alliance had a stronger claim upon them than their more recent relationship with Rome. For Caesar, however, such arguments threatened the entire network of alliances on which Roman authority in Gaul depended. These episodes reveal how the Northern Wars were shaped by far more than battlefield strength. Ambassadors, treaties, hostages, ancient alliances, migration, betrayal, and competing interpretations of diplomatic law repeatedly determined whether peace survived or collapsed, from Carbo's disastrous deception of the Teutones to Caesar's controversial treatment of the German tribes. The frontier between negotiation and warfare remained dangerously thin. By the closing years of the First Punic War, the enormous cost of the conflict had pushed both Rome and Carthage toward financial exhaustion. Years of fighting on land and sea had consumed ships, soldiers, and money at an extraordinary rate. Rome had reached the point where taxation could no longer easily finance the construction of new fleets. Even so, the Republic continued raising infantry and sending fresh forces to Sicily and North Africa year after year. Carthage faced an equally serious shortage of resources. Desperate for additional funds, the Carthaginians turned to Egypt and approached Ptolemy, asking him for a loan of 2,000 talents. The Egyptian king found himself in a difficult position because he maintained friendly relations with both sides. Rather than financing one friend against another, he attempted to encourage peace between them. When those efforts failed, he explained his refusal with a simple principle. Friendship might require helping an ally against an enemy, but it did not require supporting one friend in a war against another. The military situation eventually became unbearable for Carthage. Several major defeats followed one another, including disasters on land and at sea. The naval losses were especially damaging because Carthage had traditionally regarded maritime warfare as one of its greatest strengths. With its treasury depleted and its supply of ships and manpower increasingly limited, the government finally began searching for a way out of the conflict. The Carthaginians approached the Roman commander Gaius Lutatius and requested a suspension of hostilities. Once an armistice had been arranged, they sent representatives to Rome in the hope of negotiating peace under terms they could still accept. According to the tradition preserved in this account, they also sent the captured Roman consul Attilius Regulus with them, expecting him to persuade the Senate to approve the proposed agreement. Regulus entered the Roman Senate not as a victorious statesman returning home, but as a prisoner dressed in Carthaginian clothing. Once the Carthaginian representatives had withdrawn, however, he did the opposite of what his captors expected. Instead of recommending peace on their terms, he informed the senators that Carthage was approaching exhaustion. Its military and financial position was far worse than the embassy wanted Rome to believe. Regulus therefore advised his countrymen not to accept an easy settlement. Rome, he argued, should either continue the war aggressively until Carthage could resist no longer, or demand much harsher conditions before agreeing to peace. Having delivered this advice, he nevertheless honored the obligation under which he had been released and voluntarily returned to Carthage. Later tradition gave his death a particularly horrifying form. The Carthaginians were said to have placed Regulus inside a narrow wooden container lined with iron spikes. He was forced to remain standing because any attempt to rest his body against the sides would drive the spikes into him. Whether every detail of this famous story reflects historical reality or later Roman tradition, Regulus became an enduring symbol of loyalty to Rome and obedience to duty even at the cost of his own life. Peace eventually came, but on conditions more favorable to Rome than Carthage had originally hoped. All Roman prisoners and deserters in Carthaginian hands were to be returned. Carthage surrendered its possessions in Sicily along with the nearby smaller islands and agreed not to wage war against Syracuse or its ruler, Hero. It was also forbidden from recruiting mercenaries in Italy. A large financial penalty accompanied these territorial and military concessions. Carthage was required to pay Rome 2,000 Euboic talents over a period of 20 years, with regular payments delivered to Rome. For a state already financially weakened by decades of warfare, the indemnity added another heavy burden to the cost of defeat. Thus ended the First Punic War after 24 years of fighting. Ancient accounts describe staggering naval losses, claiming that Rome lost around 700 ships, while Carthage lost approximately 500. Whatever the exact totals, the conflict had consumed fleets on a scale rarely seen before in the Western Mediterranean. The political consequences were equally important. Most of Sicily, including the territories previously controlled by Carthage, now passed into Roman hands. Rome imposed financial obligations on Sicilian communities, distributed naval responsibilities among several cities, and began sending a praetor to administer the island. Sicily was becoming something fundamentally new in Roman history, a major overseas territory governed directly under Roman authority. Syracuse followed a different path. Hero had supported Rome during the conflict and was rewarded rather than punished. His position was recognized, and he was formally treated as a friend and ally of the Roman people. Rome was therefore combining direct control with selective partnership, a method that would become increasingly important as its Mediterranean influence expanded. For Carthage, however, the end of the Roman war did not bring peace. Almost immediately, another crisis erupted, this time from within its own military system. Gallic mercenaries who had fought for Carthage in Sicily demanded the wages still owed to them. They also expected additional rewards that Hamilcar had reportedly promised during the campaign. African soldiers serving Carthage made similar demands. Although many of them came from populations already subject to Carthaginian authority, they had fought abroad and now expected compensation. Carthage's weakened condition made them increasingly confident that pressure would succeed. There was also deep resentment. Thousands of soldiers accused of deserting to Rome had reportedly been crucified by the Carthaginians. The memory of these executions added anger to the dispute over unpaid wages. When Carthage refused to satisfy the demands being made, the confrontation exploded into rebellion. Gallic and African troops joined forces and seized Tunis as well as Utica, one of the most important cities in North Africa after Carthage itself. From these positions, the rebels expanded their movement. They encouraged other African communities to rise against Carthaginian authority, attracted Numidian support, and welcomed large numbers of escaped slaves into their ranks. The rebellion quickly became a struggle for survival. Carthaginian lands were attacked from several directions, while the government that had only recently escaped a disastrous war with Rome suddenly found itself surrounded by enemies much closer to home. The situation became so serious that Carthage appealed to its former Roman enemy for assistance. Rome did not send legions to fight on Carthage's behalf, but it did relax restrictions that might otherwise have prevented the Carthaginians from obtaining essential resources. Carthage was permitted to purchase supplies from Italy and Sicily, and, for this particular emergency, to recruit mercenaries in Italy. Roman representatives were also sent to Africa in an effort to negotiate an end to the rebellion. Their diplomatic mission achieved little, and the fighting continued. Carthage therefore had no choice but to conduct the war with determination, attempting to rebuild its authority while still recovering from defeat in the First Punic War. Years later, Sicily once again became a major battlefield between Roman power and local resistance. Two brothers, Hippocrates and Epictetus, emerged as determined opponents of Rome. Both had long been hostile toward Roman influence and attempted to persuade Syracuse to abandon its relationship with the Republic. When they failed to convince their fellow citizens, they turned toward Leontini, whose inhabitants already had disagreements with Syracuse. There they accused the Syracusan government of creating a separate arrangement with Rome, despite the earlier settlement established under Hiero, having supposedly represented the interests of Sicily more broadly. The accusation produced strong resentment among the Leontines. Syracuse reacted aggressively, offering a spectacular reward for the deaths of the two brothers. Anyone who delivered the head of Hippocrates or Epictetus would supposedly receive its weight in gold. Instead of surrendering Hippocrates, however, the people of Leontini selected him as their commander. Roman actions elsewhere in Sicily were also creating enemies. Many Sicilians had developed a deep hostility toward the Roman commander, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, whose severe methods had damaged Rome's reputation. Their anger increased after Syracuse fell through what they considered deception rather than honorable conquest. As resistance spread, Sicilian groups rallied around Hippocrates. They pledged that none would make a separate peace with Rome without the agreement of the others. The alliance was reinforced with substantial military support, including 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Marcellus faced such distrust that communities were reluctant to accept his promises unless they were guaranteed by formal oaths. When Tauromenium eventually surrendered, its inhabitants demanded clear protections. Marcellus agreed that no permanent Roman garrison would be stationed inside their city, and that the population would not be forced into military service. The agreement was confirmed under oath, reflecting how badly confidence in Roman assurances had deteriorated. Farther east, another Mediterranean conflict was developing around the island of Crete. The Cretans were believed to have shown sympathy toward Mithridates of Pontus during his wars against Rome. They were accused of providing him with mercenary soldiers and of supporting the pirates whose activities had made large areas of the Mediterranean increasingly dangerous. These accusations became especially serious when Cretan communities were suspected of openly helping pirates, pursued by the Roman commander Marcus Antonius. Roman representatives were sent to address the issue, but the Cretans reportedly treated their complaints with contempt and offered a dismissive response. Antonius answered with military force. His campaign achieved relatively little, yet he nevertheless acquired the title Creticus, associating his name permanently with Crete. He was the father of the much more famous Mark Antony, who would later become one of the central figures in Rome's civil wars and ultimately confront Octavian, the future Augustus, at Actium. Rome eventually decided that the Cretan problem required a much more serious response. When the Cretans attempted to negotiate peace, the Senate presented them with extremely demanding conditions. They were ordered to surrender Lasthenes, one of the leaders who had fought Antonius, and hand over their pirate ships. Rome also demanded the return of Roman prisoners, 300 hostages, and an enormous payment of 4,000 talents of silver. Acceptance would have meant not merely peace, but a humiliating submission to Roman authority. The Cretans rejected the terms, and Quintus Caecilius Metellus was given command of the resulting war. He defeated Lasthenes near Cydonia, forcing the Cretan commander to retreat toward Knossos. Another leader, Panaras, then surrendered Cydonia after securing a guarantee for his own safety. Metellus continued his advance and eventually moved against Knossos. Lasthenes, realizing the danger, took drastic action. Before escaping, he set fire to his own house, which was said to contain a considerable amount of money, apparently preferring to destroy his wealth rather than allow it to fall into Roman hands. The Cretans now attempted a different strategy. Instead of surrendering to Metellus, they appealed directly to Pompey the Great, who was conducting his enormous campaign against Mediterranean piracy and was also involved in the wider war against Mithridates. They offered to submit to Pompey if he personally came to receive their surrender. Pompey accepted the idea in principle. Since he was occupied elsewhere, he instructed Metellus to stop the campaign, arguing that there was little justification for continuing a war against people who had already offered to surrender. Pompey intended to come later and formally accept the submission of Crete himself. Metellus ignored him. Rather than withdraw, he continued the campaign until resistance on the island had been broken. Lasthenes eventually received terms similar to those previously granted to Panaras, and Roman control was established. The victory brought Metellus both a triumph and the title Creticus. Ancient writers considered his claim to the name stronger than that of Marcus Antonius, since Metellus had actually completed the conquest of Crete, rather than merely campaigning there. Back in Rome, meanwhile, political scandal could be every bit as dramatic as warfare abroad. One of the most famous episodes involved Publius Clodius Pulcher, a young patrician whose surname could be understood as handsome. According to the story, Clodius had become attracted to Caesar's wife, Pompeia. An opportunity appeared during the sacred ceremonies of the Bona Dea. These mysteries were reserved entirely for women, and men were strictly forbidden from attending. Because Clodius was still young and had no beard, he disguised himself completely in women's clothing and secretly entered Caesar's house during the nighttime celebration. The disguise allowed him to pass initially as a woman, but the plan soon went wrong. Clodius became separated from the person who was supposed to guide him through the house. Forced to move around unfamiliar surroundings, he eventually attracted attention. His appearance might have concealed his identity, but his voice betrayed him. Once he spoke, the women around him realized that a man had entered a ceremony from which men were absolutely excluded. The discovery created an immediate scandal, and Clodius was driven from the house. What might sound like an extraordinary private adventure quickly became a serious public affair. The Bona Dea ceremony carried profound religious importance, and violating it could not easily be dismissed as a romantic intrusion. The incident therefore brought together religion, aristocratic rivalry, personal reputation, and Roman politics, turning Clodius's reckless disguise into one of the most notorious scandals of the late Republic. The Iberian Peninsula was regarded by ancient writers as one of the largest and most geographically striking regions of the Western Mediterranean. To the north, the Pyrenees formed a formidable natural barrier stretching between the Mediterranean world and the Northern Ocean. Celtic peoples occupied much of the eastern side of this mountain zone, while Iberians and Celtiberians lived farther west and across large sections of the peninsula. Almost the entire country was surrounded by water. Only the Pyrenean frontier connected Iberia directly with the European mainland. Ancient authors described these mountains as among the greatest and most difficult in Europe, emphasizing their steep slopes and imposing scale. Along the Mediterranean coast, navigation was relatively familiar. Ships could sail through the Tyrrhenian and western Mediterranean waters toward the Pillars of Hercules, the great gateway that marked the entrance to the Atlantic. Beyond those straits, however, Roman and Mediterranean sailors were far more cautious. The Western and Northern Ocean remained largely outside ordinary Roman navigation. Voyages toward Britain were among the few exceptions, and these crossings depended heavily on understanding the tides. Britain was considered close enough to reach within part of a day under favorable conditions, yet the ocean surrounding it still seemed unpredictable and unfamiliar compared with the Mediterranean. Ancient descriptions of Iberia emphasized its extraordinary size. Some writers claimed that both its length and breadth approached 10,000 stades. Whatever the accuracy of those measurements, the essential point was clear. This was not a compact territory, but a vast region inhabited by numerous peoples, speaking different languages and living under many local political systems. The peninsula was also rich in rivers, several of them navigable and important for movement, trade, agriculture, and military campaigning. Such geography helped create a landscape in which coastal settlements, inland communities, tribal territories, and commercial centers could develop in very different ways. The earliest population history of Iberia was already difficult to reconstruct in antiquity. Roman historians themselves admitted that they were not attempting to provide a complete account of every people who had lived there before Roman expansion. One explanation for the origin of the Celtiberians was that Celtic groups had crossed the Pyrenees in an earlier age and gradually mixed with the indigenous inhabitants. From this fusion, the name Celtiberian was believed to have emerged. Long before Rome became deeply involved in Spain, Phoenician merchants had already established connections with the peninsula. Iberia attracted them because of its commercial value, and Phoenician communities occupied several strategic coastal locations that allowed them to participate in trade with local populations. Greek sailors and settlers also reached the region. Ancient tradition connected them particularly with Tartessus and with its famous ruler Arganthonius. Greek contacts with this wealthy western kingdom became part of a broader image of Iberia as a distant but prosperous land filled with opportunities for trade and colonization. Some ancient writers attempted to identify the old city of Tartessus with later settlements on the Spanish coast, though such identifications were uncertain even in antiquity. What mattered most was the memory of Tartessus as an important center associated with wealth, maritime exchange, and contact between local Iberian societies and Eastern Mediterranean visitors. Phoenician religious influence could also be seen near the Great Straits leading into the Atlantic. A sanctuary dedicated to Hercules was believed to have been founded there by Phoenicians, but the god worshipped at the site was not originally the Greek hero of Thebes. He was instead associated with the Tyrian form of Hercules, reflecting the Phoenician religious tradition from which the sanctuary developed. The rituals performed there were said to preserve distinctly Phoenician features even generations later. For Roman observers, the sanctuary was therefore evidence that Iberia had been connected with the Eastern Mediterranean long before Roman conquest began. The wealth of the peninsula eventually attracted Carthage on a much larger scale. Before Rome established a permanent presence there, Carthaginian commanders had already begun exploiting Iberia's resources, controlling some territories directly while raiding or pressuring others. Roman intervention changed the balance. Areas previously held by Carthage gradually passed into Roman possession, but the conquest of the entire peninsula was far from immediate. Rome would spend generations fighting different Iberian and Celtiberian peoples before it could claim effective control. Resistance repeatedly returned even after apparent victories. Local revolts forced Roman armies to campaign again and again, making Spain one of the most difficult territories Rome ever attempted to subdue. Once Roman rule became more firmly established, the peninsula was divided administratively and placed under provincial governors. Praetors were sent to oversee Roman interests, taxation, security, and relations with local communities. Yet this administrative structure was the result of a long process rather than a sudden conquest. The first major Roman conflict with Carthage had centered on Sicily. The second great confrontation between the two powers developed largely from their rivalry in Spain. Unlike the First Punic War, which was concentrated primarily around Sicily and the sea, the next conflict would spread across an enormous geographical area. Although Spain was at the center of the dispute, armies eventually fought in Italy and Africa as well. What began as competition over influence in the Western Mediterranean became one of the most destructive wars of the ancient world. The origins of this new struggle were closely connected with Hamilcar Barca. During the final years of the Sicilian conflict, Hamilcar had commanded Carthaginian forces and relied heavily on mercenaries and African troops. He had promised substantial rewards to many of these soldiers. When the war ended and the army returned to Africa, the promised payments became a major political problem. The soldiers demanded what they believed they were owed, and Carthage proved unable or unwilling to satisfy them immediately. The result was the violent conflict commonly known as the Mercenary War. Carthage suffered heavily, and the crisis weakened the state at precisely the moment when Rome was becoming more powerful. During these disturbances, Rome also acquired Sardinia. The Carthaginians were forced to give up the island, while Roman grievances concerning treatment of Roman merchants provided part of the justification for intervention. Within Carthage, Hamilcar's political enemies blamed him for many of these disasters. They attempted to prosecute him and make him answer for decisions connected with the previous war. Hamilcar survived by building support among influential political figures. One of the most important was Hasdrubal, who had married Hamilcar's daughter and possessed strong political connections of his own. When unrest later developed among the Numidians, Hamilcar obtained a new military command. He initially shared authority with Hanno the Great, even though questions surrounding his earlier command had not been fully resolved. After the Numidian conflict, Hanno was recalled to Carthage to answer accusations against him. Hamilcar was left in control of the army and began looking toward Spain as the foundation for a new Carthaginian future. Taking Hasdrubal with him, Hamilcar crossed Tugades and launched campaigns against Spanish peoples. According to hostile ancient interpretations, some of these communities had done nothing to provoke Carthage. For Hamilcar, however, Spain offered several advantages. Campaigning abroad kept him away from dangerous political struggles at home, while military victories allowed him to accumulate wealth, strengthen his reputation, and maintain the loyalty of his soldiers. The spoils taken during these operations were distributed carefully. A portion went directly to the troops, giving them a personal reason to remain loyal and eager for further campaigning. Another share was sent back to the Carthaginian treasury, helping demonstrate that Hamilcar's conquests benefited the state, rather than merely enriching his private faction. A third portion was reportedly distributed among his political supporters in Carthage. Through this system, military success in Spain translated into political influence at home. The strategy worked for years, but eventually resistance among the Spanish peoples became more organized. Several local rulers and chieftains united against him and prepared an unusual attack. They gathered wagons filled with wood and harnessed oxen to them. Their forces followed behind, making the formation appear strange enough that the Carthaginian troops reportedly laughed when they first saw it approaching. The humor disappeared once the trap was revealed. The Spaniards set fire to the wagons while the animals were still attached and drove the terrified oxen directly toward the Carthaginian lines. The burning animals rushed unpredictably through the battlefield, spreading fire and confusion. Carthaginian formations broke apart as soldiers attempted to avoid the flames and stampeding beasts. Once the enemy ranks had lost their organization, the Spanish warriors charged. Hamilcar himself was killed during the fighting, along with many men who attempted to defend or rescue him. His death did not end Carthaginian ambitions in Spain. The resources gained from the peninsula had become far too important, and Carthage quickly sent additional forces to preserve what had already been acquired. Hasdrubal now became commander of the Carthaginian position in Spain. Alongside him was a young man whose name would soon become famous throughout the Mediterranean: Hannibal, the son of Hamilcar. Hannibal was still young, but he already possessed a strong reputation among the soldiers. He was energetic, deeply interested in warfare, and personally connected to the army through his father's legacy. Hasdrubal appointed him to a senior military role and gradually gave him greater responsibility. Unlike Hamilcar, Hasdrubal often preferred negotiation where possible. Ancient accounts describe him as persuasive, diplomatic, and capable of winning the allegiance of Spanish communities without always resorting immediately to violence. Where diplomacy failed, however, military force remained available, and Hannibal increasingly became associated with that side of Carthaginian expansion. Through a combination of alliances, persuasion, and conquest, Carthaginian influence extended farther across the peninsula. Hasdrubal pushed from the western coastal regions deep into the interior and toward the river Ebro. The Ebro increasingly came to represent a political frontier. It divided spheres of influence and eventually became central to agreements between Rome and Carthage. The growing Carthaginian presence alarmed several Greek communities in Spain. Among them were the people of Saguntum, traditionally connected with settlers from Zacynthus, as well as Greek communities around Emporia and elsewhere along the coast. These settlements feared that continued Carthaginian expansion would eventually threaten their independence. They therefore appealed directly to Rome. The Roman Senate was already concerned about the growing strength of Carthage in Spain. Rome had defeated its rival in Sicily, but Carthage was now rebuilding wealth and manpower in another region. Roman envoys were therefore sent to negotiate limits on Carthaginian expansion. The resulting agreement identified the Ebro as an important boundary. Carthage was not to carry armed expansion beyond the agreed limit, while Rome was also expected to avoid attacking Carthaginian subjects on the other side. At the same time, Saguntum and other Greek communities were to retain their freedom and autonomy. These provisions were incorporated into the wider network of treaties connecting Rome and Carthage. On paper, they were designed to prevent another major war. In practice, they created boundaries whose interpretation would soon become a source of conflict. Hasdrubal did not live long enough to see the final breakdown. During his administration of Carthaginian Spain, he was assassinated while on a hunting expedition. His killer was reportedly a slave whose master Hasdrubal had previously executed with great cruelty. The assassination was therefore presented as an act of personal revenge. The murderer was captured, and Hannibal responded with extreme severity. He ordered the man tortured before his death, making the punishment a public warning against similar acts. With Hasdrubal gone, the army faced the question of succession. The soldiers themselves strongly supported Hannibal and proclaimed him their new commander. Despite his youth, he possessed the loyalty of the troops, experience in Spanish warfare, and the prestige of belonging to the Barcid family. The Carthaginian government eventually confirmed the army's choice. Back in Carthage, however, the political enemies of Hamilcar and Hasdrubal saw an opportunity. The deaths of the older Barcid leaders seemed to weaken the faction that had dominated Spanish affairs. Because Hannibal was still young, his opponents underestimated him. They renewed attacks against the allies and supporters of his family, and revived older accusations that had remained unresolved. Popular resentment also worked against the Barcid faction. Many citizens remembered the harsh political conditions associated with Hamilcar and Hasdrubal, and were willing to support investigations against their former supporters. Those who had received wealth and gifts from the Barcid leaders were ordered to surrender some of these resources to the public treasury. The argument was that such wealth ultimately came from military booty and therefore belonged to the state. The threatened faction immediately turned to Hannibal. Messages were sent to Spain warning him that the attack on his father's supporters was only the beginning. If Hannibal abandoned the men who defended his interests in Carthage, they warned, he would eventually be left politically isolated and vulnerable to the same enemies. Hannibal reportedly understood the danger very clearly. He had watched his father and Hasdrubal spend years balancing military command abroad against political hostility at home. He did not intend to remain permanently exposed to the changing moods of Carthaginian politics. Ancient accounts portray him as believing that the state could easily become ungrateful toward men who had previously served it. There was also the famous tradition concerning Hannibal's childhood oath. According to the story, Hamilcar had once brought his young son before an altar and made him swear that he would never become a friend of Rome. Whether the oath happened exactly as later writers described it, or became part of the legend surrounding Hannibal, It perfectly reflected the reputation he later acquired as Rome's most determined enemy. By the time he controlled the Carthaginian army in Spain, Hannibal possessed both political and personal reasons for seeking a major confrontation. Africa was relatively quiet. Carthaginian Spain was becoming increasingly secure. Without a new crisis, Hannibal risked becoming vulnerable to political attacks from home. A great war, on the other hand, would make him indispensable. If Carthage were drawn into a prolonged struggle requiring its strongest commander, his domestic enemies would have far less freedom to move against him and his supporters. Rome provided the obvious target. Hannibal believed that victory over the Republic could transform Carthage's position completely. If Rome were defeated, no Western rival of comparable strength would remain. Carthage could potentially dominate the Mediterranean on an unprecedented scale, while Hannibal himself would gain a reputation greater than that of any commander before him. Even failure in this interpretation offered a different kind of immortality. The attempt itself would be remembered as one of the boldest military challenges ever undertaken. Thus, the struggle for Spain was moving towards something far larger than a provincial conflict. The ambitions of Hannibal, the political rivalry within Carthage, Roman anxiety over expanding Carthaginian power, and the uncertain status of communities such as Saguntum were all converging. The agreements intended to preserve peace were still formally in place, but the balance behind them was already collapsing. Spain had become the frontier on which two Mediterranean powers were preparing, deliberately or otherwise, for a war that would soon reach far beyond the peninsula itself. Hannibal understood that a direct move across the Ebro could become the opening act of a much larger conflict. Rather than attack immediately without justification, he first created a political pretext. He encouraged the Turbulates, a people living near Saguntum, to accuse the Saguntines of invading their territory and committing repeated abuses against them. Once these complaints had been formally presented, Hannibal sent representatives of the Turbulates to Carthage. At the same time, he wrote private messages to the Carthaginian authorities claiming that Rome was secretly encouraging unrest throughout the Carthaginian-controlled regions of Spain, and that Saguntum was cooperating with this effort. These accusations were repeated often enough to create the impression that a serious threat was developing. Hannibal continued sending reports until the Carthaginian Senate finally gave him broad authority to deal with Saguntum according to his own judgment. With political approval secured, Hannibal arranged another confrontation. The Turbulates once again appeared with complaints, while the Saguntines were invited to send representatives of their own. Hannibal proposed that both sides present their case before him and allow him to settle the dispute. The Saguntine ambassadors refused to recognize his authority as an impartial judge. They insisted that the matter should instead be submitted to Rome. Hannibal immediately ordered them to leave his camp. That night, he acted. His entire army moved across the Ebro and entered Saguntine territory. The surrounding countryside was devastated, and siege equipment was brought against the city itself. An immediate assault failed to break the defenses, so Hannibal changed his approach. He surrounded Saguntum with fortifications, digging ditches and constructing barriers intended to isolate the city completely. Guards were stationed around the perimeter, and the siege continued through repeated attacks and periods of pressure rather than a single continuous assault. For the Saguntines, the attack had come with extraordinary speed. They had little time to prepare and immediately appealed to Rome for help. The Senate responded by sending Roman envoys alongside Saguntine representatives. Their instructions were clear. They were first to remind Hannibal of the existing agreements between Rome and Carthage and demand that he respect them. If he refused, they were to continue directly to Carthage and formally accuse him before the government there. When the Roman delegation reached the coast near Hannibal's camp, however, he refused to receive them. The envoys therefore sailed onward to Carthage together with the Saguntine representatives. Before the Carthaginian authorities, they again invoked the treaty and demanded that the attack on Saguntum be stopped. The Carthaginians rejected the accusation and instead argued that Saguntum itself had repeatedly mistreated communities subject to Carthaginian authority. The Saguntines then proposed arbitration. They were willing, they said, to place the dispute before Rome and accept a formal judgment. Carthage refused. Its representatives replied that no outside arbitration was required because Carthage possessed both the right and the power to avenge injuries committed against its dependents. When news of this response reached Rome, the Senate became divided over what should happen next. Some senators argued for immediate military intervention on behalf of Saguntum. Others advised caution. They pointed out that Saguntum was not formally listed as a Roman ally under the existing agreement. It had been described as free and autonomous, but that was not necessarily the same thing as being protected by a military alliance. This more cautious interpretation prevailed. Rome did not immediately send an army. Inside Saguntum, the consequences were devastating. As the siege continued and no Roman relief appeared, food supplies began disappearing. Hannibal refused to relax the blockade because he knew the city was wealthy and expected its capture to provide enormous rewards. Eventually, the Saguntines understood that outside rescue was unlikely. They made a desperate decision to deny Hannibal the wealth he wanted. Public and private stores of silver and gold were gathered together in the central square. The precious metals were then melted down and mixed with lead and bronze so that they would lose much of their practical value. The gesture was both economic and symbolic. If the city had to fall, the defenders were determined that Hannibal would not enjoy the full reward of conquering it. Starvation soon became unbearable. Rather than remain behind the walls and slowly die from hunger, the surviving defenders chose to make one final attack. They emerged from the city at night and struck the Carthaginian siege lines while many of the soldiers were sleeping. The surprise initially worked. Some attackers killed men. Before they could rise from their beds, while others cut down soldiers struggling to find their weapons in the confusion, the fighting soon developed into a full battle. The Saguntines continued until almost their entire force had been destroyed, taking many of Hannibal's troops with them. From the city walls, the women watched the destruction of their husbands and relatives. Ancient tradition describes the final hours of Saguntum in extremely tragic terms. Some women threw themselves from rooftops, others hanged themselves, while some killed their children before taking their own lives. Thus ended the resistance of a city that had once been prosperous, powerful, and confident enough to appeal directly to Rome. When Hannibal discovered that the Saguntines had destroyed much of their gold and silver, he reacted with fury. Surviving adults were subjected to brutal punishment, and many were killed. Yet Hannibal also recognized the strategic value of the location. Saguntum stood near the sea, relatively close to Carthaginian territory, and possessed productive land around it. Rather than leave the site abandoned, he resettled the city and transformed it into a Carthaginian settlement. Ancient writers later associated the place with a name resembling Spartarian Carthage. The destruction of Saguntum finally forced Rome to respond directly. A new embassy was sent to Carthage with an ultimatum. The Romans demanded that Hannibal be surrendered as the man responsible for violating the treaty. If Carthage refused, Rome would treat the entire state as responsible for his actions, and war would follow immediately. Carthage refused to hand him over. Ancient tradition preserves a dramatic scene from the final diplomatic exchange. The senior Roman envoy supposedly gathered a fold of his toga and told the Carthaginians that he carried within it either peace or war, and that they could choose which they wanted. The Carthaginians replied that the decision should be his. The Roman opened the fold and declared that he offered them war. The response from the assembly was equally direct. They accepted it. The diplomatic struggle was over. Rome and Carthage had entered another war. News was sent immediately to Hannibal informing him that the treaty restrictions were effectively finished. He was now free to expand throughout Spain without having to pretend that the earlier boundaries remained binding. Hannibal moved quickly. Nearby peoples were approached one after another. Some were persuaded to submit through negotiation. Others were frightened into obedience, and those who resisted were defeated by force. Meanwhile, Hannibal began assembling a much larger army. He did not publicly reveal the true purpose of these preparations. His real objective was not simply to secure Spain. He intended to invade Italy itself. To prepare for this extraordinary campaign, he sent representatives among the Gallic peoples whose territories lay along his expected route. Their cooperation would be essential if his army hoped to survive the journey. He also ordered investigations of the Alpine passes. Routes through the mountains had to be identified before a large army, cavalry, baggage train, and elephants could attempt the crossing. Once these preparations were underway, Hannibal left his brother Hasdrubal in charge of Carthaginian Spain and began moving toward Italy. The Romans did not initially understand what he was planning. They assumed that the war would mainly be fought in Spain and Africa. The possibility that a Carthaginian army might march overland into Italy seemed so improbable that Roman strategy was built around offensive campaigns elsewhere. Tiberius Sempronius Longus was therefore sent toward Africa with a large fleet, 2 legions, and extensive naval support. At the same time, Publius Cornelius Scipio received orders to operate in Spain. He was given 60 ships, approximately 10,000 infantry, and 700 cavalry. His brother Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio accompanied him as a senior subordinate. The entire plan changed when merchants from Massilia brought shocking intelligence. Hannibal had crossed the Alps and entered Italy. Publius Scipio immediately recognized the danger. If Hannibal reached the Italian communities before Roman armies could respond, he might gain allies, destroy Roman forces separately, and bring the war directly into the heart of the Republic's territory. Scipio therefore handed command of the Spanish expedition to his brother Gnaeus and turned back toward Italy with his fastest warships. What followed became the most famous phase of Hannibal's career. For roughly 15 years, Roman armies struggled to remove him from Italy. His victories and campaigns there became so extraordinary that ancient historians treated them almost as a separate story within the larger Roman-Carthaginian conflict. Back in Spain, however, the war continued. At first, Gnaeus Scipio achieved relatively little on his own. The situation changed when Publius later returned to the peninsula after his term of office had expired and was granted authority to continue campaigning as proconsul. From that point forward, the 2 Scipio brothers worked together against Carthaginian power in Spain. Their principal opponent was Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother. The situation temporarily shifted in Rome's favor when Carthage recalled Hasdrubal and part of his army to deal with Safax, the Numidian ruler who was creating problems in North Africa. With the main Carthaginian commander absent, the Scipios defeated the forces that remained and expanded Roman influence. Numerous Spanish communities voluntarily joined them. The brothers proved capable not only on the battlefield, but also in diplomacy, gaining allies through negotiation and persuasion rather than conquest alone. Their success, however, did not last. After Carthage reached an arrangement with Syphax, Hasdrubal returned to Spain with a stronger army than before. He brought reinforcements and approximately 30 war elephants. 2 additional commanders arrived as well, Mago and another Hasdrubal, the son of Gisco. The presence of 3 major Carthaginian commanders transformed the campaign. The Scipios now faced a much more dangerous enemy. Even so, they continued winning several engagements. Carthaginian troops suffered substantial casualties, and a number of elephants were also killed. Winter eventually interrupted the fighting. The Carthaginian armies established winter quarters in Turdetania. Gnaeus Scipio remained near Orso, while Publius took position at Castulo. There, Publius received intelligence that Hasdrubal was advancing. Rather than wait passively, he left the city with a relatively small force in order to examine the enemy's position. The reconnaissance ended in disaster. Publius unexpectedly encountered Hasdrubal's forces and was surrounded by enemy cavalry. Unable to escape, he was killed along with the men accompanying him. Gnaeus Scipio did not immediately know that his brother was dead. Around the same time, he sent soldiers out to obtain grain. they encountered another Carthaginian force and became involved in fighting. When Gnaeus learned that his men were in danger, he moved rapidly with light infantry to assist them. By then, the first Roman detachment had already been cut off. The Carthaginians turned against Gnaeus and forced him to retreat into a fortified tower or similar defensive position. The refuge offered only temporary protection. The Carthaginian soldiers set the structure on fire, killing Gnaeus and the men trapped inside. Within a short period, both Scipio brothers had been destroyed. Their deaths were a severe blow to the Roman position in Spain. They had earned considerable respect among communities that had abandoned Carthage and joined Rome, and many of these allies now found themselves exposed. When the news reached Rome, anxiety spread quickly. The Republic sent new forces under Marcellus and Claudius Nero, including infantry, cavalry, ships, and additional supplies. Yet they failed to reverse the strategic situation decisively. Carthaginian influence expanded until it covered almost all of Spain, while Roman forces were pushed back toward a narrow zone close to the Pyrenees. For Rome, the danger was now greater than ever. Hannibal was already devastating large parts of Italy in the south, while Carthaginian armies in Spain appeared capable of opening another route toward the peninsula from the north. Roman leaders feared that if Spain were abandoned, those armies could eventually cross the Pyrenees and Alps and join the struggle in Italy. For that reason, Rome could not simply withdraw from Spain, even when the situation there looked hopeless. The Spanish front had become essential to the survival of the wider war. Holding even a small foothold prevented Carthage from freely transferring the full resources of the peninsula into Italy. What had begun with Hannibal manipulating a local dispute around Saguntum had therefore grown into a conflict stretching across Spain, Italy, Africa, and the western Mediterranean. The fall of one city had broken the fragile peace between Rome and Carthage. From that point forward, both powers were locked into a war in which control of Spain would remain almost as important as the battles being fought against Hannibal inside Italy. Rome now faced a serious problem in Spain. After the deaths of the two Scipio brothers, the Roman position there had become dangerously weak, yet abandoning the peninsula was not an option. A day was therefore appointed for choosing a new commander. When the assembly gathered, however, no experienced general stepped forward to accept the responsibility. The silence only deepened the anxiety in Rome. Spain had already claimed the lives of two respected commanders, while Hannibal continued devastating Italy. Taking command of another difficult front offered enormous risk and little guarantee of success. Then a surprisingly young candidate came forward. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the son of the Roman commander who had recently died in Spain, was only about 24 years old. Despite his age, he had already gained a reputation for intelligence, confidence, and personal courage. Scipio addressed the assembly with extraordinary intensity. He spoke about the deaths of his father and uncle and presented the Spanish command as something almost destined for him. No one, he argued, had a greater reason to continue their struggle or avenge what had happened to them. But his ambitions went much further than simple revenge. He promised not merely to recover Spain, but eventually to carry Roman power into Africa and even against Carthage itself. At a moment when Rome was struggling to hold its existing positions, such claims sounded astonishingly bold. Some listeners considered his words youthful exaggeration, yet the effect on the Roman people was powerful. After years of defeats and uncertainty, confidence itself had value. Scipio's promises revived the mood of an assembly that had only moments earlier been overwhelmed by fear. He was chosen to command in Spain. Older Romans remained skeptical. They argued that what appeared to be courage might actually be recklessness. Scipio heard these criticisms and responded by calling another public meeting. Once again he spoke confidently, insisting that his age would not prevent him from fulfilling the command. Yet he also issued a challenge to his critics. If any older and more experienced Roman wished to take his place, Scipio would willingly surrender the appointment. No one volunteered. The absence of another candidate strengthened his position dramatically. What had first seemed like youthful ambition now appeared to many as genuine courage, especially when those questioning him refused to accept the same danger themselves. Scipio departed for Spain with approximately 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. Under normal circumstances, such an important campaign might have received a much larger force, but Rome could spare little while Hannibal remained inside Italy. He was also provided with money, military equipment, and 28 warships. With these limited resources, the young commander crossed into Spain and took control of the Roman forces already stationed there. After combining the veteran troops with his newly arrived soldiers, Scipio formally purified the army through the customary religious ceremony. He then addressed his men in much the same confident style he had used before the Roman assembly. His arrival quickly became known throughout Spain. Many communities were exhausted by Carthaginian domination and still remembered the earlier Scipios favorably. Stories began circulating that the son of one of those commanders had been sent back, almost by divine intervention, to restore Roman fortunes. Scipio did little to discourage such beliefs. Instead, he increasingly presented his decisions as if they were guided by supernatural favor. Whether he personally believed this completely or recognized its usefulness as a political and military tool, the image became an important part of his leadership. He soon received crucial intelligence about the Carthaginian position. Their armies were divided among several camps located far apart from one another. Altogether, they possessed roughly 25,000 infantry and more than 2,500 cavalry, but their forces were dispersed. Even more importantly, much of their military wealth had been concentrated in one place: New Carthage, the great Carthaginian stronghold in Spain. The city contained money, weapons, siege equipment, food supplies, ships, prisoners, and hostages collected from communities throughout the peninsula. It was protected by approximately 10,000 Carthaginian troops under Mago. For Scipio, the opportunity was extraordinary. Instead of slowly confronting several Carthaginian armies in separate campaigns, he could strike directly at the logistical center that supported them. New Carthage also possessed valuable silver resources, fertile surrounding territory, excellent maritime connections, and a powerful harbor. If Rome captured it, Scipio would gain not only enormous supplies, but also a secure base from which to operate both by land and sea. Its location also offered a relatively direct route toward Africa. In a single operation, Scipio might obtain a fortress, a naval station, financial resources, hostages, and strategic access to the wider Carthaginian world. He kept the plan secret. At sunset, Scipio led his army away from its position and marched through the entire night toward New Carthage. The speed and secrecy of the movement prevented the Carthaginians from preparing for his arrival. By the following morning, the Romans were already outside the city. Scipio immediately began surrounding it with defensive works and preparing for a full assault. Siege ladders and engines were positioned around most of the walls. One section, however, received less obvious attention. On the southern side, the walls were bordered by a lagoon connected with the sea. Because the water normally protected this approach, Carthaginian guards considered it relatively secure. Scipio had noticed something important about this supposedly natural defense. During the night, Roman siege engines were loaded with stones and missiles, while the fleet moved into the harbor to prevent Carthaginian ships from escaping. Scipio approached the coming battle with remarkable confidence, apparently assuming that the city could be taken quickly. Before sunrise, the assault began. Roman soldiers operated siege machines against the walls, while others attacked defenders positioned along the upper fortifications. Stones, arrows, javelins, sling projectiles, and missiles from artillery filled the air as both armies committed everything available to the struggle. Mago had prepared carefully as well. He placed a large body of soldiers near the gates, ready to launch sudden counterattacks. Because fighting near the entrances would occur in confined spaces, many were equipped primarily with swords rather than longer weapons. Other troops occupied the walls, supported by catapults, stones, missiles, and defensive machinery. The result was an intense battle in which neither side initially showed signs of breaking. The Romans suffered heavily. Carthaginian soldiers repeatedly rushed out through the gates and attacked the men operating the siege engines. These sudden assaults caused serious casualties and disrupted Roman attempts to bring equipment close to the walls. Yet the Carthaginians also paid heavily for each attack. The Romans refused to withdraw, and over time their greater persistence began to make a difference. Eventually ladders reached the walls in significant numbers, forcing the defenders to abandon some of their offensive sorties and return to the fortifications. The Carthaginian troops who had been fighting outside withdrew through the gates, closed them behind themselves, and climbed onto the walls to reinforce the defenders. This created another difficult phase for the Romans. Their attacks were now meeting a much stronger concentration of resistance. Scipio moved continuously across the battlefield, encouraging soldiers and observing the progress of the assault. During this movement, he noticed something happening along the southern side of the city. The water in the lagoon was retreating. At high water, the area could be deep enough to reach a man's chest, making an attack there difficult. But at low tide, the water dropped dramatically, leaving sections shallow enough to cross. Scipio quickly confirmed that the tide would remain low for several hours. He immediately recognized the opening. Rushing among his troops, he announced that the gods themselves had created a path into the city. The language fit perfectly with the growing belief that divine forces were guiding his campaign. He ordered ladders brought toward the newly exposed section of wall and called upon the soldiers to attack through the lagoon. According to the dramatic version of the story, Scipio personally seized a ladder and attempted to lead the assault himself. His attendants and nearby troops prevented him from exposing himself so recklessly, but the gesture energized the men around him. Large numbers of ladders were carried through the shallow water and placed against the low wall. The Carthaginians had concentrated much of their attention elsewhere and were not prepared for a major attack from this direction. Roman soldiers began climbing. Fighting remained fierce. Men exchanged blows on the walls while shouting echoed from different parts of the city. Gradually, however, the Romans established a foothold and captured several defensive towers. Scipio immediately used psychology to magnify the success. He ordered trumpeters and buglers onto the captured towers and commanded them to sound loudly as though the entire city had already fallen. The effect was immediate. Roman soldiers elsewhere heard the signals and believed victory was close, encouraging them to attack with renewed energy. Inside the defenses, the Carthaginians heard the same sounds and feared that Romans had already penetrated deeply into the city. Confusion spread. Some Roman soldiers descended from the walls and reached the gates from inside. They opened them, allowing Scipio and the main Roman force to pour into New Carthage. The civilian population withdrew into their homes, while organized Carthaginian resistance concentrated around the marketplace. Mago assembled what remained of his troops there and attempted to continue the defense. The Romans attacked them directly, killing large numbers. With his position collapsing, Mago retreated with the survivors towards the citadel. Scipio followed immediately and prepared another assault. Mago understood that further resistance was hopeless. His troops were exhausted, demoralized, and greatly reduced in number. He surrendered. New Carthage had fallen in a single day of fighting, only a few days after Scipio had arrived before its walls. The speed of the victory transformed his reputation. A commander who had seemed dangerously young when he left Rome had captured one of the most important Carthaginian centers in Spain through secrecy, aggression, careful observation, and remarkable good fortune. The success also strengthened the belief that Scipio possessed a special relationship with the gods. He increasingly encouraged this image throughout the rest of his career. Later traditions claimed that he sometimes entered the capital alone and closed the doors behind him, creating the impression that he was privately consulting the divine powers before making important decisions. His reputation eventually became so distinctive that his image received unusually prominent treatment in Roman ceremonial traditions. Yet the practical rewards of capturing New Carthage were even more important than the legend. The Romans seized enormous quantities of military equipment and supplies. Weapons, missiles, siege engines, food, grain, precious materials, and other resources fell into Scipio's hands. The city's dockyards contained 33 warships. Large quantities of ivory, silver, and gold were also captured. Some precious metal existed as coins, some as manufactured objects, and some remained uncoined. Even more valuable politically were the hostages. Carthage had collected individuals from Spanish communities and held them in the city as guarantees of loyalty. Their capture suddenly gave Scipio an extraordinary diplomatic opportunity. There were also prisoners and Roman property previously taken during earlier Carthaginian victories. The following day, Scipio performed sacrifices and formally celebrated the success. He praised his soldiers and distributed rewards according to their conduct in the assault. The man credited with being first over the wall received the greatest prize. The next received a smaller reward, and others were compensated according to their individual achievements. Scipio then addressed the inhabitants of the city. Rather than treating every captive as an enemy, he attempted to use victory to build political support. Prisoners from Spanish communities were released and allowed to return home. The gesture sent a powerful message across the peninsula. Communities that cooperated with Rome might recover relatives who had been held by Carthage as political guarantees. Scipio encouraged them to remember the generosity associated with the Scipio family. This combination of battlefield victory and calculated mercy became one of his greatest strengths. He was not simply trying to destroy Carthaginian armies, he was attempting to dismantle Carthage's political network in Spain and replace it with loyalty to Rome. Much of the captured gold, silver, and ivory was loaded onto seized vessels and sent back to Rome. The reaction there was enormous. For 3 days the city celebrated with public thanksgiving. After years of losses, fear, and the continuing presence of Hannibal in Italy, Rome finally had spectacular news from Spain. The victory also sent shockwaves throughout the peninsula. Spanish communities that had believed Carthage dominant suddenly saw one of its richest and strongest bases captured almost overnight. The Carthaginians were equally stunned. Scipio had changed the Spanish war with a single operation. He had gained ships, money, weapons, supplies, hostages, prisoners, a major harbor, and a strategic base while damaging Carthaginian prestige throughout the region. More importantly, he had demonstrated that Rome's defeat in Spain had not been final. The young commander who had promised before the Roman people to avenge his father and uncle had begun doing exactly that, and the capture of New Carthage marked the first great step in a campaign that would eventually carry him far beyond Spain itself. After securing New Carthage, Scipio immediately strengthened its defenses. The section of wall exposed whenever the tide withdrew was raised and reinforced so that the same weakness he had exploited could never be used against the Romans. With the city safely garrisoned, he turned his attention once more to the wider struggle for Spain. Scipio did not rely entirely on force. Wherever possible, trusted representatives were sent ahead to negotiate with Spanish communities and persuade them to abandon Carthage. Towns willing to cooperate were treated diplomatically, while those that continued resisting were attacked. 2 major Carthaginian commanders still remained in the field, and both were named Hasdrubal. One was Hasdrubal, son of Hamilcar and brother of Hannibal. He was operating far from Scipio's immediate position, recruiting mercenaries among the Celtiberians. The other, Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, concentrated on preventing the remaining Carthaginian allies from changing sides. Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, sent messengers throughout loyal towns with promises that enormous reinforcements would soon arrive. His objective was to keep these communities from surrendering to Rome before Carthage could restore its military strength. He also dispatched Mago into neighboring regions to recruit as many mercenaries as possible. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal himself entered the territory of Lyrsa, which had revolted against Carthaginian control, and prepared to attack communities there. Scipio moved against him before those plans could develop. Hasdrubal withdrew toward Boetica and established his position nearby, but Scipio attacked almost immediately. The Carthaginians were defeated, their camp was captured, and Boetica itself fell into Roman hands. Hasdrubal now understood that scattered resistance could no longer stop Scipio. He therefore attempted to concentrate the remaining Carthaginian strength in Spain around Cremona. A large number of Spanish troops gathered there under Mago, while Numidian cavalry arrived under Massinissa. Hasdrubal placed his infantry inside a fortified camp. Mago and Massinissa remained outside with the cavalry, prepared to protect the approaches and challenge the Romans before they could reach the main defensive position. Scipio responded by dividing his own cavalry. Laelius was ordered to confront Mago, while Scipio personally took responsibility for opposing Massinissa. The Numidians immediately proved difficult opponents. Their style of cavalry warfare depended upon speed, mobility, and constant movement. They would ride forward, throw their javelins, retreat before the Romans could close with them, and then suddenly turn back for another attack. For some time, Scipio struggled to find an answer. His cavalry could not easily catch the Numidians, while repeated missile attacks gradually wore down the Roman formation. Eventually, Scipio changed tactics. Instead of allowing the Numidians enough distance to retreat, reorganize, and return, he ordered his men to lower their spears and pursue them continuously. The pressure prevented Massinissa's horsemen from executing their normal cycle of withdrawal and renewed attack. Without enough space to turn properly, they were forced farther and farther back until they eventually retreated toward their camp. Scipio did not continue the pursuit recklessly. He stopped and established his own camp in a strong position, roughly 10 stades from the Carthaginian army. The numbers facing him were intimidating. Ancient accounts give the Carthaginian side approximately 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 36 elephants. Scipio's force was said to be less than 1/3 as large. For this reason, he initially avoided a full-scale engagement. Smaller clashes continued, but Scipio hesitated to commit his entire army against such overwhelming numbers. Time, however, began working against him. Roman supplies diminished, and hunger threatened to become more dangerous than the enemy. Retreat was possible, but Scipio believed that withdrawing would damage both Roman prestige and the confidence of the Spanish communities now watching the campaign closely. He therefore prepared his soldiers psychologically for battle. After performing a sacrifice, Scipio assembled the army and once again adopted the mysterious behavior that had become part of his public image. He announced that a familiar divine sign had appeared to him and had instructed him to attack. His argument was simple. Roman success should not be measured purely by numbers. Earlier victories had been achieved despite unfavorable odds, and divine favor, he claimed, mattered more than numerical superiority. To strengthen the performance, he ordered the priests to bring forward the sacrificial remains so the soldiers could see them. Then, while speaking, Scipio noticed birds flying overhead. He immediately turned toward them, pointed dramatically into the sky, and declared that the gods had sent yet another sign promising victory. He followed their movement with intense attention, shouting and moving as though he were receiving divine confirmation before the eyes of the army. The soldiers became caught up in the moment. As Scipio turned, they turned. As he looked toward the birds, thousands of men looked with him. Anxiety about the size of the enemy gradually gave way to excitement and confidence. Scipio did not allow that enthusiasm to disappear. He announced that after such signs there could be no delay. The army would fight immediately. The soldiers ate, armed themselves, and prepared to advance. Silanus received command of the cavalry, while Laelius and Marcius were given important responsibilities among the infantry. The sudden Roman movement caught the Carthaginians off guard. Their camps were only a short distance away, and Hasdrubal, Mago, and Massinissa were forced to assemble their troops quickly and under considerable confusion. Many had not even eaten before being ordered into battle. The fighting began across both cavalry and infantry lines. Roman horsemen again applied the lesson learned from their previous encounter with the Numidians. They refused to give Massinissa's cavalry enough space to disengage comfortably. By maintaining constant pressure, the Romans reduced the effectiveness of Numidian javelins and prevented their opponents from using repeated withdrawals and sudden returns. The infantry battle was much harder. The Carthaginian and African troops possessed a significant numerical advantage and pressed heavily against the Roman line. For most of the day, Scipio's infantry struggled simply to maintain its position. He moved repeatedly across the battlefield, encouraging different units, but the pressure continued. At last, Scipio attempted an extraordinarily dangerous act. He handed his horse to a young attendant, seized a shield from one of the soldiers, and rushed alone into the open ground between the opposing armies. He shouted toward his men that their commander was now in danger and called upon the Romans to save him. Those nearest could see exactly what he had done. Others farther away heard the cry spreading through the ranks. The effect was explosive. Fear for Scipio's life combined with shame at the idea of allowing their general to stand exposed before the enemy. Roman soldiers surged forward with renewed aggression. The exhausted African troops could no longer withstand the charge. Their condition was worsened by hunger. Many had entered the battle before eating and had been fighting throughout the day. The Carthaginian line finally gave way. For a brief period, the retreat turned into a devastating slaughter. Ancient figures place Roman losses at around 800, while approximately 15,000 of their opponents were said to have died. The Battle of Carmone, which had remained uncertain for much of the day, ended as another major Roman victory. The surviving Carthaginian forces withdrew as rapidly as possible, with Scipio following closely behind and attacking whenever he could catch them. Eventually, the fugitives reached a defensible position, supplied with enough food and water to withstand pressure. A direct assault offered little chance of success, and taking the position would require a prolonged siege. Scipio had other responsibilities elsewhere in Spain, so he left Silanus to maintain the blockade while he moved against other communities. The trapped Carthaginians eventually abandoned the position and retreated again. They continued south until they reached the straits and crossed toward Gades. Silanus pursued them as far as circumstances allowed, inflicted whatever damage he could, and then returned to join Scipio at New Carthage. Meanwhile, Hasdrubal, son of Hamilcar, had been recruiting soldiers far to the north. Hannibal, still campaigning in Italy, urgently needed reinforcements and called upon his brother to bring another army across the Alps. Hasdrubal began the journey while attempting to conceal his intentions from Scipio. Instead of following an obvious route, he moved along the northern coast and crossed the Pyrenees into Gaul with the Celtiberian mercenaries he had recruited. His aim was to reach Italy before Rome understood what was happening. If he could join Hannibal there, the strategic situation might change dramatically. While events in Spain continued, Scipio was already thinking beyond the peninsula. His brother Lucius returned from Rome with important political news. There was serious discussion of eventually giving Scipio command of an expedition to Africa. This was exactly the opportunity Scipio had long wanted. He understood that defeating Carthage permanently would require more than removing its armies from Spain. The war would ultimately have to be carried into Carthaginian territory itself. Before such an invasion could succeed, however, alliances in North Africa would be essential. Scipio therefore sent Laelius across the sea with 5 ships to meet Syphax, one of the most important Numidian rulers. Laelius carried gifts and reminded Syphax of earlier friendly relations with the Scipio family. He also asked whether Syphax would support Rome if a Roman army eventually invaded Africa. Syphax initially agreed. He accepted the Roman gifts and sent presents of his own in return, giving Scipio reason to believe that a valuable alliance was developing. Carthage quickly learned what was happening and sent representatives of its own to compete for Syphax's loyalty. For Scipio, the issue was too important to leave entirely to intermediaries. He decided to cross to Africa personally. Taking Laelius with him, Scipio sailed with only 2 ships to meet Syphax face to face. The journey was dangerous from the beginning. As Scipio approached the African coast, Carthaginian representatives who were already present with Syphax attempted to intercept him with warships, apparently without Syphax's knowledge. Scipio reacted quickly. His ships raised their sails and escaped pursuit, reaching the harbor before the Carthaginians could stop them. Syphax received both Roman and Carthaginian delegations, but he secretly concluded an agreement with Scipio and exchanged pledges with him. When Scipio departed, Syphax also prevented the Carthaginians from immediately following. He kept them occupied until the Roman ships had gained enough distance to escape safely. The meeting produced one of the more memorable stories associated with Scipio's career. At a banquet hosted by Syphax, Scipio reportedly found himself dining near Hasdrubal, son of Gisco, one of his principal Carthaginian enemies. For a brief moment, the battlefield rivalry was replaced by conversation. Hasdrubal questioned Scipio on numerous subjects and came away deeply impressed by the young Roman's confidence and manner. According to the story, Hasdrubal later told his companions that Scipio was dangerous, not only when commanding armies, but even while reclining at dinner. Back in Spain, however, warfare continued without pause. Several Celtiberian and Spanish mercenaries, whose home communities had already joined Rome, were still serving under Mago. Marcius attacked one group and killed around 1,500 men, scattering the survivors back toward their towns. Another force, consisting of approximately 700 cavalry and 6,000 infantry under a commander named Hanno, became trapped on elevated ground. Hunger gradually reduced them to desperation. They finally sent representatives to Marcius and asked for terms. Marcius began by demanding that they surrender Hanno and all deserters serving among them. The soldiers agreed. Even though Hanno was their own commander and was present during the negotiations, they seized him and delivered him to the Romans. Marcius then demanded that Roman prisoners also be surrendered. Again they complied. Next, he instructed them to bring a specified amount of money down from the hill to the plain, explaining that men asking for mercy should not remain in a fortified position while negotiating. They descended. Only then did Marcius reveal his final demand. He told them that they deserved death because they had continued fighting for Carthage even after their own communities had submitted to Rome. Nevertheless, he offered them their lives if they surrendered their weapons. This was too much. The Celtiberians angrily refused to disarm, declaring that they would rather fight than submit under those conditions. A fierce battle followed. They resisted with great determination, but roughly half were killed. The remainder succeeded in escaping and eventually joined Mago. Mago had recently arrived near Hanno's former position with around 60 warships. Once he learned what had happened, he withdrew to Gades. There he remained largely inactive, waiting for circumstances to improve while increasingly suffering from shortages of food and supplies. Scipio continued tightening Roman control over the peninsula. Silanus was sent to receive the surrender of Castax, but instead of opening its gates, the inhabitants responded with hostility. Silanus therefore established a camp outside the city and informed Scipio that force might be necessary. Scipio sent siege equipment toward Castax and prepared to follow personally, but another target attracted his attention first. That target was Ilurgia. The city had once supported Rome during the campaigns of Scipio's father and uncle. After their deaths, however, Ilurgia had secretly changed sides. Worse still, it had reportedly welcomed Roman soldiers while pretending friendship, only to betray them and deliver them into Carthaginian hands. For Scipio, this was an act that demanded punishment. He attacked Ilurgia with extraordinary intensity and captured the city in only a few hours. During the fighting, he was wounded in the neck, but he refused to leave the battlefield and continued until resistance had collapsed. The Roman soldiers were equally furious. Their anger over the earlier betrayal became so great that they ignored even the usual desire for plunder. Instead, according to the ancient account, they killed the inhabitants indiscriminately, including women and children, despite receiving no formal order to do so. The destruction continued until the city itself was effectively wiped out. Scipio then moved toward Castax. This time he chose a different strategy. He divided the army into 3 sections and surrounded the city, but he deliberately avoided launching an immediate assault. Reports had reached him that many inhabitants were already considering surrender, and he wanted to give them time to act. The strategy worked. The inhabitants turned against members of the Carthaginian garrison who opposed capitulation, killed those who resisted, and surrendered the city to Scipio. Scipio installed a new garrison, but otherwise treated the city more moderately than Ilurgia. He placed local administration in the hands of a respected citizen rather than imposing complete direct control. He then returned to New Carthage and sent Silanus and Marcius toward the Straits with orders to damage the remaining Carthaginian-held territories as extensively as possible. One of the communities they encountered was Ustapa. Unlike Castax, Ustapa had consistently supported Carthage and had never attempted to hide where its loyalty stood. The inhabitants understood what defeat might mean. If Roman forces captured the city, many expected enslavement and the destruction of their community. Rather than wait passively, they prepared for an extraordinary final defense. All valuable possessions were gathered together in the marketplace. Wood was piled around the treasure, and the women and children of the city were placed near the heap. 50 leading men were chosen to remain behind. They swore that if the battle outside was lost, they would kill the women and children, burn the collected wealth, and then die in the same fire themselves. The rest of the fighting population prepared for battle. Calling upon the gods as witnesses to their decision, they suddenly charged out against Marcius. The attack caught the Romans by surprise. Roman light infantry and cavalry were driven back before they could properly organize themselves. When the Astapians reached the heavier legionary troops, they continued fighting with extraordinary desperation. For a time, their determination gave them an advantage. But courage could not overcome numbers indefinitely. The Romans gradually surrounded and overwhelmed them. Almost every Astapian who had joined the attack died fighting. Once the 50 men left inside the city realized that the defenders had been destroyed, they carried out the oath. The women and children were killed, the pile of valuables was set on fire, and the men themselves entered the flames. When the Romans finally controlled Ustapa, they found little of value left to seize. Marcius was reportedly struck by the determination of the inhabitants. In recognition of their courage, he refrained from destroying the remaining houses simply for the sake of vengeance. The capture of Astapa, therefore, became a strange kind of Roman victory. The city had been defeated militarily, but its inhabitants had deliberately denied the conquerors prisoners, wealth, and the satisfaction of ordinary plunder. Across Spain, the conflict was now reaching its final stage. Carthaginian armies were being pushed towards the coast, communities were changing allegiance, and Scipio was combining diplomacy, calculated mercy, intimidation, and extreme retaliation depending on how each city behaved. At the same time, events were beginning to move beyond Spain once again. Hasdrubal was marching toward Italy, Scipio was building connections in Africa, and the struggle between Rome and Carthage was preparing to enter a new phase in which the decisive battlefield would eventually move to the African homeland of Carthage itself. Soon after these successes, Scipio became seriously ill, and temporary command of the Roman army passed to Marcius. His absence immediately exposed tensions that had been growing among some of the soldiers. A number of them had spent their earnings recklessly and now believed that years of campaigning had brought them too little reward. In their eyes, they had endured the danger while Scipio received the fame. Resentment turned into open mutiny. The dissatisfied troops abandoned Marcius, established a separate camp, and were soon joined by soldiers from several Roman garrisons. What began as anger over pay quickly developed into an organized military rebellion. Mago saw an opportunity. His agents approached the mutineers with money, and encouraged them to abandon Scipio completely. They accepted the payments, selected commanders and centurions from among themselves, reorganized their camp according to their own wishes, imposed military discipline, and exchanged oaths of loyalty with one another. When news of the uprising reached Scipio, he chose persuasion before force. He sent private messages explaining that his illness had prevented him from distributing the rewards still owed to the soldiers. Loyal troops were encouraged to speak with their rebellious comrades and convince them that reconciliation was still possible. Scipio then sent a message to the entire mutinous force as though the dispute had already been settled. He announced that their outstanding payments were ready and ordered them to come to New Carthage, where they would also receive provisions. The offer divided the rebels. Some suspected a trap and argued that Scipio could not be trusted. Others believed that the general genuinely intended to settle their complaints. After discussion, however, the entire group agreed to travel to New Carthage together. Scipio was ready for them. Before their arrival, he instructed the senators accompanying him to identify the principal leaders of the revolt. Each senator was to approach one of these men in a friendly manner, speak with him privately, invite him into his quarters, and quietly place him under control without attracting attention. The military tribunes received another set of instructions. Before sunrise, each was to position a group of reliable soldiers around the meeting place. They were to remain inconspicuous, but keep their swords ready. If anyone attempted to provoke resistance once the assembly began, he was to be killed immediately without waiting for another command. Shortly after dawn, the sick Scipio was carried to the tribunal. Heralds were sent through the city ordering the mutinous troops to assemble before him. The summons took them completely by surprise. Many felt embarrassed at the thought of forcing their ill commander to wait, while others assumed they had simply been called to receive the money and supplies promised in his message. They hurried toward the meeting place with almost no preparation. Some arrived without weapons. Others wore only their tunics because they had not even taken enough time to dress fully. Only after they had gathered did they realize the situation had changed. Scipio began by condemning their behavior. He reminded them of the seriousness of abandoning military discipline and turning against their own command. Yet he also separated the ordinary soldiers from those who had organized the rebellion. He declared that the entire army would not be punished. Responsibility would fall primarily upon the men who had led the mutiny. Then the trap closed. At Scipio's signal, officials divided the assembled soldiers into two groups. The senators who had already identified the principal conspirators seized them and dragged them into the center. The captured leaders shouted desperately for their comrades to intervene, but the soldiers surrounding the assembly immediately killed anyone who attempted to answer those appeals. Faced with armed troops on every side, the remaining mutineers understood that resistance was impossible. The crowd fell silent. Scipio ordered the ringleaders publicly punished. They were beaten with rods, with especially severe treatment reserved for those who had tried to call the army to rebellion even after their arrest. They were then executed. The rest received a pardon. In this carefully planned combination of deception, intimidation, selective punishment, and mercy, Scipio restored discipline without destroying a large part of his own army. Yet the mutiny had already encouraged enemies elsewhere in Spain. Indibilis, one of the local chiefs who had previously reached an understanding with Scipio, took advantage of the disorder and attacked territory now under Roman authority. Scipio responded personally once his condition allowed him to return to command. Indibilis fought fiercely. Ancient accounts claim that his forces killed approximately 1,200 Romans before the battle turned against him. His own losses were far greater. Around 20,000 of his men were said to have fallen, leaving him with little choice but to request peace. Scipio accepted negotiations rather than attempting to destroy him completely. Indibilis was required to pay a financial penalty, after which another agreement was concluded. At roughly the same time, an alliance of enormous future importance was developing with Massinissa. The Numidian prince secretly crossed the straits without Hasdrubal's knowledge and met with Scipio. There he promised friendship, and swore that if Rome eventually carried the war into Africa, he would join the Roman side. Massinissa had powerful personal reasons for abandoning Carthage. He had previously fought alongside the Carthaginians, and Hasdrubal's daughter had been promised to him in marriage. The arrangement connected him closely with one of the most important Carthaginian families. But Syphax, another Numidian king, also became attracted to the same woman. For Carthage, Syphax's political allegiance was too valuable to ignore. Seeking to secure him against Rome, the Carthaginians gave Hasdrubal's daughter to Syphax instead, apparently without properly consulting Massinissa. Hasdrubal himself understood how insulting the decision would be. Out of respect for Massinissa, he attempted to keep the arrangement hidden from him. The truth eventually emerged. Massinissa regarded the decision as a profound betrayal. His political position, his personal honor, and his relationship with Carthage were all damaged at once. Scipio now offered an alternative. Massinissa transferred his loyalty to Rome and became one of Scipio's most important allies. Unlike many temporary alliances made during the war, this partnership proved remarkably durable and would later become decisive when the struggle moved to North Africa. Meanwhile, Carthaginian hopes in Spain were rapidly collapsing. Mago, commanding what remained of their naval and military presence, no longer believed that Carthage could recover the peninsula. He sailed toward Liguria and Gaul, hoping to recruit mercenaries and perhaps create another threat to Rome from northern Italy. His departure left Gades exposed. The Romans moved in and took control of the city, removing one of the last major Carthaginian positions in Spain. Roman rule now began taking a more permanent form. From around this period, Rome increasingly sent praetors to Spain on a yearly basis. These officials were responsible for supervising conquered communities and maintaining stability in territories that had passed under Roman control. Scipio did not leave behind an enormous occupation force. Instead, he established what he considered sufficient troops for maintaining peace while Roman administration gradually took shape. He also had to decide what to do with soldiers who had been seriously wounded or whose health no longer allowed them to continue campaigning. Rather than simply send them away, Scipio founded a settlement for them. He named the community Italica, after Italy. What began as a settlement connected with Roman veterans would later become one of the most famous Roman cities in Spain. Centuries afterward, it would be remembered especially as the homeland associated with the emperors Trajan and Hadrian. With Carthaginian power in Spain effectively broken, Scipio prepared to return home. His departure was deliberately impressive. A large fleet carried him toward Rome, accompanied by prisoners, weapons, money, and enormous quantities of captured material. The display made visible what his Spanish command had achieved. The reception in Rome was spectacular. Only a few years earlier, many had considered him far too young for the responsibility he had demanded. Some had dismissed his promises of great victories as little more than reckless boasting. Now he returned after capturing New Carthage, dismantling much of Carthaginian power in Spain, winning numerous communities to Rome, and forcing the enemy from most of the peninsula. Even his political rivals found it difficult to deny the scale of his achievements. The ambitious claims he had made before leaving Rome no longer sounded like the fantasies of an inexperienced young commander. Many of them had become reality. Scipio received extraordinary honors and enormous public admiration. His youth made the victories appear even more remarkable, and he was granted the distinction of a triumph. Yet Spain was not completely peaceful. Almost immediately after Scipio left the peninsula, Indibilis rebelled again. Roman commanders responded by assembling troops from existing garrisons and calling upon forces from communities that had accepted Roman authority. This time, the confrontation ended permanently for Indibilis. His army was defeated, and he was killed. The Romans then moved against those regarded as responsible for encouraging the uprising. Leading conspirators were brought to trial, condemned to death, and stripped of their property. Communities that had supported the revolt also faced collective punishment. They were fined, disarmed, and forced to surrender hostages as guarantees of future loyalty. Additional Roman troops were stationed among them so that another rebellion would be much harder to organize. With these final measures, the first major phase of Rome's war for Spain came to an end. Carthaginian domination had been broken, but Roman control was only beginning. The peninsula was not yet fully conquered, and future generations of Roman soldiers would fight many more campaigns against Spanish and Celtiberian peoples. For Scipio, however, Spain had already served its purpose. He had arrived as an unusually young commander trying to recover a collapsing Roman position. He left with New Carthage captured, Carthaginian armies driven away, Massinissa moving toward alliance with Rome, and his own reputation transformed. The promise he had made years earlier was also entering its final stage. Spain had been the beginning, not the destination. His attention was now turning toward Africa and toward Carthage itself. While Rome was occupied with wars against the Gauls of the Po Valley and Philip of Macedon, unrest once again spread across Spain. Many of the local peoples believed that Rome's attention was divided and that this was the perfect moment to challenge its authority. The Romans initially responded by sending Sempronius Tuditanus and Marcus Helvius, followed later by Minucius. Yet the rebellion continued to grow, forcing Rome to commit a much more formidable commander to the struggle, Marcus Porcius Cato. Cato was still relatively young, but he had already developed a reputation for extraordinary discipline, endurance, intelligence, and powerful public speaking. His abilities as an orator were so highly regarded that some Romans compared him with Demosthenes, the celebrated statesman and speaker of ancient Greece. When Cato reached Emporiae in northeastern Spain, he discovered that enemy forces from the surrounding regions had gathered against him in enormous numbers, reportedly reaching around 40,000 men. Rather than rushing into battle, Cato spent a short period preparing and disciplining his army. Then he made a dramatic decision. Before confronting the enemy, he sent away the ships that had carried his forces to the region. Retreat by sea was no longer possible. His soldiers now understood that defeat might mean destruction. Cato deliberately transformed this danger into a psychological weapon, telling his men that the enemy's numerical advantage mattered less than their own determination. Courage, he argued, could overcome superior numbers, but without the ships there would be no escape if they failed. The battle that followed was long and fiercely contested. Cato constantly moved among his soldiers, encouraging them and reinforcing parts of the line that came under pressure. Fighting continued until evening, with heavy casualties on both sides. At a critical moment, Cato climbed to higher ground with 3 reserve cohorts so that he could observe the battlefield more clearly. From there, he saw that the Roman center was beginning to struggle. Instead of remaining safely behind the lines, Cato personally led the reserve into the threatened sector. The sudden Roman charge, accompanied by loud battle cries, broke the opposing formation and changed the course of the fighting. What had been an uncertain struggle became a Roman victory. Cato refused to allow the defeated army time to recover. His forces pursued the fugitives throughout the night, seized their camp, and inflicted further losses. When he returned, his soldiers celebrated him as the man who had personally turned the battle in their favor. Only afterward did he allow the exhausted army to rest and distribute the benefits of the captured spoils. Military victory, however, was only the beginning of Cato's strategy. Delegations soon arrived from communities across the region, and he demanded additional hostages to secure their obedience. He then devised a remarkably simple method of weakening numerous towns simultaneously. Sealed letters were prepared and sent to their magistrates, with every messenger instructed to deliver the order on the same predetermined day. Each letter commanded the town receiving it to demolish its own defensive walls immediately. Failure to obey would bring severe punishment, including the threat that the inhabitants might be sold into slavery. Because communication between the towns required time, none of them knew whether the command had been directed specifically at them or issued throughout the region. Each community therefore faced the same uncertainty. Resistance might be possible if everyone resisted together, but disastrous if a single town stood alone. With Roman soldiers waiting nearby and no opportunity to coordinate a common response, the towns chose survival. One after another, they dismantled their own fortifications. In a single day, communities along the Ebro effectively destroyed much of their defensive strength, without Cato having to besiege them individually. The strategy greatly reduced their ability to resist Roman authority and helped preserve peace in the region for a considerable period. Yet Roman control over Spain remained unstable. Several decades later, new rebellions erupted among communities suffering from shortages of land. Among those involved were the Luzones, who lived near the Ebro. The Roman consul Fulvius Flaccus marched against the rebels and defeated them, causing many to scatter back toward their settlements. Others, particularly those who possessed little or no land and lived a more mobile existence, gathered at a recently established and rapidly growing fortified city called Complega. From this stronghold, they issued an extraordinary challenge to Flaccus. They demanded compensation for every warrior they had lost in the previous conflict: a cloak, a horse, and a sword for each dead man. They also ordered the Roman commander to leave Spain, threatening consequences if he refused. Flaccus answered with calculated mockery, declaring that he would bring them plenty of cloaks. He then followed their messengers and appeared before Complega with his army. The confidence of the rebels disappeared almost immediately. Instead of confronting the Romans as they had threatened, they fled and plundered neighboring communities as they escaped. The account also describes the distinctive heavy cloak worn by peoples of the region, fastened with a clasp and known as the sagum, a garment that would soon play an unexpected role in another episode of the war. Flaccus was eventually replaced by Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. During his command, the Roman allied city of Caravis came under siege from approximately 20,000 Celtiberians. Gracchus hurried toward the city, but the enemy surrounded it so completely that he could not inform the defenders that Roman assistance was close. A cavalry officer named Cominius proposed a dangerous solution. Wearing a Spanish sagum, he disguised himself as a local warrior and quietly mixed among enemy foragers. His disguise allowed him to enter the Celtiberian camp without attracting attention. From there, he managed to slip into Caravis and inform the defenders that Gracchus was approaching. The news transformed the situation inside the city. Knowing that help was near, the inhabitants continued resisting instead of surrendering. 3 days later, Gracchus arrived, and the besieging Celtiberians withdrew. Caravis had survived largely because one Roman officer had managed to cross the enemy lines through disguise rather than force. Soon afterward, Gracchus faced another dangerous situation involving Complega. Around 20,000 men approached his camp, carrying olive branches and presenting themselves as peaceful petitioners. Once they were close enough, however, they suddenly attacked, throwing the Roman position into confusion. Gracchus responded with deception of his own. Rather than desperately defending the camp, he deliberately abandoned it and ordered what appeared to be a retreat. Believing the Romans had been defeated, the attackers entered the camp and began plundering it. At precisely that moment, Gracchus turned his army around and attacked them while their formation was broken. Most were killed, and Complega itself fell into Roman hands. Gracchus did not rely entirely on punishment after his victory. He attempted to address some of the deeper causes of instability by providing poorer inhabitants with places within the community and distributing land among them. He also negotiated carefully defined agreements with the surrounding tribes. These peoples formally became friends of Rome, with both sides confirming the arrangements through oaths. The agreements established by Gracchus became important long after his departure. During later conflicts, people repeatedly looked back on his settlement as a period when relations between Rome and the Celtiberian communities had achieved a degree of stability. His combination of battlefield success, diplomacy, and political settlement earned him considerable fame both in Spain and at Rome, where he was ultimately rewarded with a magnificent triumph. That stability did not last forever. A new and much more serious conflict eventually emerged around Segeda, an important city belonging to the Celtiberian people known as the Belli. Segeda had been included within the earlier agreements negotiated by Gracchus. Over time, however, the city expanded its influence by persuading inhabitants of smaller settlements to relocate within its territory. It then began constructing an enormous defensive wall, reportedly extending for 40 stades. The neighboring Titi were also compelled to participate in the project. When news of these developments reached the Roman Senate, the response was immediate. Segeda was ordered to stop building its fortifications. Rome also demanded the restoration of tribute and insisted that the inhabitants provide soldiers for Roman military service, obligations connected with the earlier treaty arrangements. The people of Segeda challenged Rome's interpretation of the agreement. They argued that Gracchus had prohibited the foundation of new Celtiberian cities, but had never forbidden existing settlements from strengthening their defenses. They also maintained that Rome itself had later released them from the obligations of tribute and military service. Their argument was not entirely false. Rome had indeed granted exemptions. The crucial problem was that such concessions remained valid only for as long as the Senate and Roman people wished them to remain in force. From the Roman perspective, therefore, privileges once granted could later be withdrawn. The dispute escalated rapidly. Rome sent the commander Nobilior into Spain with an army approaching 30,000 men. The people of Segeda realized that their unfinished walls could not protect them against such a force. Taking their families with them, they abandoned the city and fled to the territory of the Arevaci, another powerful Celtiberian people. The Arevaci welcomed the refugees and chose a Segedian warrior named Carus as their commander. He quickly demonstrated why they trusted him. Only 3 days after taking command, Carus positioned approximately 20,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in a dense forest along the route of the advancing Roman army. When Nobilior's troops entered the area, the Celtiberians struck from concealment. A fierce battle followed, remaining uncertain for a considerable time before turning into a major Roman disaster. Thousands of Roman citizens were killed. Yet the victory proved costly for the Celtiberians as well. During the disorderly pursuit that followed, Roman cavalry guarding the baggage attacked their pursuers. Carus himself was killed while fighting with exceptional courage, and darkness eventually brought the confused struggle to an end. The battle occurred during the Roman festival dedicated to Vulcan. The memory of the defeat became so powerful that Roman commanders afterward regarded the date with deep suspicion and avoided beginning battles on that day unless circumstances forced them to fight. Following the death of Carus, the Arevaci gathered at Numantia, one of the strongest cities in the region, and selected 2 new commanders, Ambo and Luco. Nobilior, determined to recover from his earlier defeat, advanced toward the city and established his camp nearby. Reinforcements soon reached him from Massinissa of Numidia, including several hundred cavalrymen and 10 war elephants. The elephants offered Nobilior a weapon that the Celtiberians had never encountered in battle. He initially concealed the animals behind his forces. Once combat began, the Roman formation opened and the elephants suddenly appeared. The psychological effect was immediate. Celtiberian soldiers and horses were terrified by the enormous, unfamiliar creatures and retreated toward Numantia. For a moment, Nobilior seemed close to achieving a decisive victory. The elephants were brought directly towards the fortifications, while Roman soldiers pressed the attack. Then everything changed. A heavy stone thrown from the defenses struck one elephant on the head. The wounded animal panicked, turned away from the enemy, and charged back into the Roman ranks. Its cries frightened the other elephants, causing them to panic as well. The animals began trampling, striking, and throwing Roman soldiers without distinguishing friend from enemy. The Roman formation collapsed into confusion. The weapon that had terrified the Celtiberians only moments earlier was now devastating the army that had brought it onto the battlefield. The defenders of Numantia immediately recognized the opportunity. They rushed from the city and attacked the disorganized Romans, pursuing them as they fled. Thousands of Roman soldiers were killed, several elephants were lost, and numerous weapons and military standards fell into Celtiberian hands. The Celtiberians also suffered substantial casualties, but the battle was another humiliating setback for Nobilia. His difficulties continued. An attempt to seize enemy supplies stored near Axinium failed and cost him additional men. He later sent a cavalry officer named Biesius to a neighboring tribe in search of an alliance and additional horsemen. Although the allies accompanying Biesius managed to escape a Celtiberian ambush, Biesius himself was killed along with many of his soldiers. The repeated Roman defeats had consequences beyond the battlefield. Osilis, where the Romans had stored provisions and money, abandoned its allegiance and joined the Celtiberians. Nobilia's army was left increasingly isolated and short of supplies. With winter approaching, he withdrew into his camp and attempted to survive under increasingly miserable conditions. The winter became another enemy. Food and supplies were scarce, while heavy snow and intense cold struck the Roman camp. Soldiers sent outside to collect firewood died from exposure, while others suffered within the overcrowded defenses. Nobilia's campaign, which had begun with a massive army and expectations of restoring Roman authority, ended in exhaustion, deprivation, and repeated military failure. The following year, command passed to Claudius Marcellus. He arrived with 8,000 infantry and 500 cavalry and immediately demonstrated a more cautious approach. The Celtiberians attempted to ambush him, but Marcellus advanced carefully and avoided being trapped. He then brought his entire army before Ocellus. Unlike his predecessor, Marcellus quickly persuaded the city to submit. Rather than destroying it, he offered pardon in exchange for hostages and imposed a financial penalty of 30 talents of silver. His willingness to negotiate quickly attracted the attention of other communities. The Nergobriges soon sent representatives asking what conditions would be necessary for peace. Marcellus demanded 100 cavalrymen as auxiliaries. The Nergobriges agreed, but before the agreement could fully take effect, some of their people attacked the Roman rear guard and carried away baggage animals. They later delivered the promised 100 horsemen and claimed that the raid had been committed by men who were unaware that peace negotiations were underway. Marcellus was not convinced. He placed the 100 cavalrymen in chains, sold their horses, devastated Nergobrigian territory, distributed the captured property among his soldiers, and moved against their city. Roman siege engines approached the walls while siege works were constructed around the defenses. Faced with the prospect of destruction, the Nergobriges sent a herald to ask for mercy. Instead of carrying the traditional herald's staff, the messenger appeared wearing a wolf skin. Marcellus refused to make a separate peace with them. He declared that forgiveness would be considered only if the Arevaci, Belli, and Titi all joined them in requesting a settlement. The three peoples responded eagerly. Their ambassadors approached Marcellus and asked him to impose only a moderate punishment and restore the arrangements once established by Gracchus. After years of rebellion, ambushes, sieges, Roman disasters, and Celtiberian resistance, the treaties of an earlier generation had once again become the standard to which both sides looked when searching for a way out of the conflict. Yet peace was far from simple. Other native communities that had suffered attacks from these tribes opposed the proposed settlement, revealing how deeply the wars had divided the peoples of Spain themselves. Rome was not confronting a single united enemy, but a complicated landscape of rival communities, shifting alliances, local grievances, and competing interests. The struggle for Spain had become more than a sequence of battles. It was a prolonged contest over land, security, political independence, and the expanding authority of Rome. Marcellus decided that the dispute should now be carried directly to Rome. Representatives from both sides were sent before the Senate, while Marcellus privately wrote to influential senators, urging them to accept a peaceful settlement. His motives were not entirely selfless. He clearly hoped to end the conflict before another commander could take over, allowing him to claim the political prestige of having restored order in Spain. When the delegations reached Rome, the division between allies and enemies was made immediately visible. Those representing communities regarded as friendly to Rome were welcomed within the city and treated as guests. The envoys from hostile groups, however, were required to remain outside the walls, following established Roman custom. The Senate showed little enthusiasm for reconciliation. Many senators remembered that these same communities had refused to submit when Nobilio had demanded their obedience. From the Roman perspective, offering favorable terms now might appear to reward resistance. The Senate therefore rejected the peace proposal and informed the ambassadors that Marcellus himself would communicate Rome's final position. At the same time, preparations began for another campaign in Spain. This recruitment was unusual. Complaints had grown that Roman consuls were unfairly selecting some citizens for difficult military service while allowing others to receive easier assignments. To reduce accusations of favoritism, soldiers for the new Spanish army were chosen by lot rather than through the customary method of enrollment. Command of the expedition was given to the consul Licinius Lucullus. Serving beneath him was a young Cornelius Scipio, a man whose reputation would later become enormous. In the years ahead, he would be remembered as the conqueror of Carthage and eventually of Numantia itself. While Lucullus was still traveling toward Spain, Marcellus moved quickly. He informed the Celtiberians that another Roman army was approaching and returned their hostages when they requested them. He also summoned the leading Celtiberian representative, who had recently been in Rome, and held a long private conversation with him. Even at the time, this meeting attracted suspicion. Later events made Marcellus's intentions appear even clearer. He seemed determined to convince the Celtiberian leaders to place themselves completely under his authority so that he could conclude the war before Lucullus arrived and took the credit. Soon afterward, around 5,000 Arevaci entered and occupied Negobrega. Marcellus then advanced toward Numantia and established his camp only a short distance from the city. As Roman pressure increased, the Numantines were driven behind their defenses. At this point, their leader, Liteno, called for negotiations. Marcellus agreed to meet him. Liteno announced that the Belli, Titi, and Arevaci were willing to place themselves entirely in Marcellus's hands. The Roman commander was delighted. He demanded hostages and financial payments from the tribes, received what he asked for, and then allowed them to return home. In this way, the conflict involving the Belli, Titi, and Arevaci was brought to an end before Lucullus could even reach the theatre of war. Marcellus had achieved exactly what he seems to have wanted. Peace had been concluded under his command, and the prestige of ending the campaign belonged to him. For Lucullus, however, this created a serious problem. He had arrived expecting a war that could bring him military glory and wealth, only to find that the principal conflict had already been settled. Ancient accounts portray him as ambitious and financially troubled, and these pressures appear to have shaped what happened next. Rather than returning without achievement, Lucullus turned his attention toward the Vacaei, another Celtiberian people living near the Arevaci. The Vacaei had not attacked Rome, nor had they personally wronged Lucullus. More importantly, he possessed no authorization from the Senate to begin a war against them. Nevertheless, he crossed the Tagus River and marched toward the city of Corca, establishing a camp nearby. The inhabitants were confused by his arrival and sent representatives to ask why a Roman army had appeared before their city. What grievance, they wanted to know, justified war. Lucullus claimed that he had come to defend the Carpetani, whom he accused the Vacaei of mistreating. The people of Carca withdrew behind their walls, but they did not remain passive. They soon launched attacks on Roman soldiers who had gone out to gather wood and supplies, killing many and chasing the survivors back toward the camp. A larger battle followed. The Corcae fought effectively as lightly armed troops, relying heavily on missile weapons and maintaining the advantage for much of the engagement. Eventually, however, their supply of projectiles was exhausted. They were not accustomed to standing against a direct Roman assault at close range, and their formation began to collapse. As they rushed back toward the city, confusion broke out at the gates. Men crowded against one another in their attempt to reach safety, and approximately 3,000 were reportedly killed during the retreat. The following day, the elders of Carcha approached Lucullus wearing ceremonial crowns and carrying olive branches as symbols of peace. Once again, they asked what they had to do to establish friendly relations with Rome. Lucullus presented harsh conditions. The city had to surrender hostages, pay 100 talents of silver, and provide its cavalry for Roman use. Desperate to avoid further destruction, the inhabitants accepted every demand. Then Lucullus added another condition. A Roman garrison had to be admitted inside the city. The people of Carcha agreed to this as well, believing that submission would protect them. Lucullus selected 2,000 Roman soldiers and secretly instructed them to seize control of the city walls as soon as they entered. Once the walls were secured, the rest of the Roman army was brought inside. Then, at the signal of a trumpet, Lucullus ordered the slaughter of the adult male population. The inhabitants were horrified. They appealed to the gods associated with oaths, promises, and agreements, accusing the Romans of betraying the peace that had just been sworn. Their protests accomplished nothing. The killing continued. According to the account, only a small number escaped from a population of around 20,000, many surviving only by throwing themselves down from the steep walls near the gates. The city was then thoroughly plundered. Whatever Lucullus hoped to gain from Carcha, the consequences extended far beyond the city itself. News of the betrayal spread rapidly through the region. Roman promises could no longer easily be trusted, and Lucullus's actions seriously damaged Rome's reputation among the surrounding peoples. Communities living in the countryside began abandoning exposed settlements. Some fled into difficult mountain terrain, while others sought protection behind the strongest fortifications available. They carried away whatever food and possessions they could move. Anything that had to be left behind was often burned so that the Romans would find little worth taking. Lucullus therefore advanced through increasingly empty territory. The devastation he encountered was not evidence of easy conquest. It was a deliberate strategy of denial. The local population was removing the supplies upon which the Roman army depended. Eventually, Lucullus reached Carcha, where more than 20,000 infantry and around 2,000 cavalry had gathered for protection. Despite what had happened at Carcha, he attempted to persuade the inhabitants to negotiate. Their response was bitter and direct. They reminded him of the massacre and asked whether he was offering them the same kind of agreement he had offered the Carchae. Instead of reflecting on the accusation, Lucullus became furious. He responded by devastating the surrounding countryside and preparing a formal siege. Roman troops established positions around the city, constructed siege mounds, and repeatedly formed for battle in an attempt to draw the defenders into a major engagement. The defenders refused. Rather than meeting the Roman army in open battle, they remained protected by their defenses and relied heavily on missiles. During these confrontations, one Celtiberian warrior became particularly famous. He wore impressive armor and repeatedly rode into the open space between the two armies, challenging individual Romans to fight him in single combat. No one initially accepted. Each time the challenge went unanswered, the warrior mocked the Romans, performed a celebratory dance, and returned to his own lines. After watching this happen repeatedly, the young Scipio could tolerate the humiliation no longer. Although still inexperienced and physically smaller than his opponent, he stepped forward and accepted the challenge. The duel ended in Scipio's favor. His victory had a powerful effect on Roman morale. A challenge that had embarrassed the army had been answered, and the young officer's personal courage earned him increasing respect among the soldiers. Yet the siege remained far from successful. During the following night, confusion spread through the Roman camp. A group of enemy cavalrymen who had gone out to gather supplies before Lucullus had surrounded the city returned and discovered that every route back inside had been blocked. Unable to enter Carcha, they rode around the Roman lines shouting loudly. The defenders inside the walls shouted back to them. In the darkness, The exchange of voices created uncertainty among Roman soldiers who could not clearly understand what was happening around them. Fear spread quickly through the camp. The Roman army was already exhausted. Constant guard duty and lack of sleep were weakening the men, while unfamiliar food was causing serious illness. Normal Roman supplies had become scarce. There was no wine, salt, vinegar, or olive oil. Instead, soldiers survived mainly on wheat, barley, venison, and rabbit meat. Much of the meat was boiled without salt. Combined with exhaustion and poor camp conditions, this diet contributed to severe digestive disease. Dysentery spread through the army, killing many soldiers even before the enemy could reach them. Eventually, Roman engineers completed a siege mound and used their machines to batter a section of Intercartia's defenses until part of the wall collapsed. Roman troops rushed through the opening, believing that they had finally broken into the city. Instead, the assault became another disaster. The defenders quickly overwhelmed them. Forced to retreat through unfamiliar streets and terrain, many Roman soldiers fell into a large reservoir. Unable to escape, large numbers drowned or were killed there. During the night, the defenders repaired the damaged section of wall. By this stage, however, suffering existed on both sides. The Romans were weakened by illness, hunger, exhaustion, and repeated failures, while famine had begun to affect the inhabitants of Intercartia as well. Negotiations finally became possible. Scipio personally promised the defenders that if they accepted an agreement, the Romans would respect it. His reputation for honorable conduct had already become strong enough that the people of Intercartia were willing to trust him even after Lucullus's betrayal at Corca. A settlement was reached. The inhabitants agreed to provide Lucullus with 10,000 cloaks, livestock, and 50 hostages. These were considerable demands, but they were enough to end the siege. Lucullus had hoped for something much more valuable. One of the reasons he had begun the campaign was his belief that the peoples of Spain possessed enormous quantities of gold and silver. He therefore demanded precious metals from the inhabitants of Intercartia. He received none. The reason was simple. They did not possess the treasure he imagined. According to the account, these particular Celtiberians attached little importance to gold and silver, leaving Lucullus without the wealth that had partly motivated his campaign. Still searching for profit and prestige, Lucullus moved on toward Pallantia, a city famous for the courage of its inhabitants. Large numbers of refugees had gathered there, increasing both its population and its defensive strength. Some of Lucullus's advisors warned him not to attack. Pallantia had a reputation for being extremely difficult to defeat. Lucullus ignored them. He had heard that the city was wealthy, and the possibility of plunder was enough to convince him to continue. Yet Pallantia proved difficult in a different way. Its cavalry constantly attacked Roman foraging parties, preventing Lucullus from gathering enough food to sustain his army. Supply shortages became increasingly serious. No decisive victory seemed possible, and remaining near the city threatened to weaken the army further. Lucullus was finally forced to retreat. He arranged his army in a long rectangular formation as it withdrew, maintaining defensive order while Pallantian cavalry continued attacking and harassing the column. The pursuit continued all the way to the Douro River. Only after the Romans crossed into safer territory did the Pallantians turn back under cover of darkness. Lucullus then moved south into the territory of the Turdetani and established winter quarters. His war against the Vacae was effectively over. It had never been formally authorized by the Roman people or Senate. It had begun largely because Lucullus wanted the wealth and military reputation that a successful campaign might provide. It had included deception, massacre, difficult sieges, disease, hunger, failed assaults, and eventual retreat. Yet despite everything that had happened, Lucullus was never formally called to account for conducting the war. The episode revealed one of the darker realities of Roman expansion in Spain. Campaigns were not always driven by immediate threats to Rome or even by clear strategic necessity. Personal ambition, competition between commanders, expectations of plunder, and the desire for military prestige could all influence decisions that affected entire populations. At the same time, the resistance of cities such as Intercartia and Palantia demonstrated that Roman military superiority did not guarantee easy conquest. Geography, strong, fortifications, mobile cavalry, disrupted supply lines, and determined local resistance could transform a seemingly straightforward invasion into a costly struggle. And the campaigns were far from finished. The conflicts unfolding across Iberia were gradually creating a generation of Roman commanders and Spanish opponents whose names would become inseparable from one of the most difficult chapters in Rome's western expansion. While Roman commanders were struggling to impose control over the Celtiberian interior, a new and equally dangerous conflict was developing farther west. The Lusitanians, one of the independent peoples of the Iberian Peninsula, had begun raiding territories under Roman protection. Their leader at this stage was a warrior named Punicus, and under his command the Lusitanians rapidly became a serious threat. Roman forces led by the praetors Manilius and Calpurnius Piso attempted to stop them, but the campaign ended disastrously. The Romans were driven from the field, and around 6,000 men were killed. Among the dead was Terentius Varro, serving as quaestor. The scale of the victory transformed Lusitanian confidence. Punicus no longer limited himself to attacks close to Lusitanian territory. His forces pushed westward toward the Atlantic, devastating regions associated with Rome as they advanced. The Vetones, another powerful people of western Iberia, eventually joined his army, increasing the strength of the movement. Together they turned against the Blastophoenicians, a population living under Roman authority. Ancient tradition connected these people with African settlers supposedly established in Iberia by Hannibal during the period of Carthaginian power. Whether every detail of that story was accurate or not, the community was remembered as having both Iberian and African connections. During the operations against them, Punicus was suddenly killed after being struck in the head by a stone. Leadership then passed to Caesarus. The Romans responded by sending another army under Mummius. At first, events appeared to favor Rome. Caesarus met the new commander in battle and was defeated, forcing the Lusitanians to retreat. Mummius believed that victory was already his. His soldiers pursued the fleeing enemy without maintaining proper formation, and the chase quickly became disorganized. Caesarus recognized the opportunity. Instead of continuing his retreat, he rallied his warriors and turned against the scattered Romans. The reversal was devastating. Around 9,000 Roman soldiers were reportedly killed. The Lusitanians recovered the booty that the Romans had previously taken from them, retook their own camp, and then captured the Roman camp as well. Large quantities of weapons and military standards fell into their hands. For Rome, the loss of military standards was particularly humiliating. They were powerful symbols of the honor and identity of Roman units. The victorious warriors understood their importance and deliberately carried the captured standards throughout Celtiberian territory as trophies, using them to mock Roman power and advertise the scale of their success. Mummius was left with only around 5,000 soldiers. The survivors had suffered not merely a tactical defeat, but a serious psychological shock. Mummius therefore refused to risk another immediate battle. He kept his remaining troops inside their camp and subjected them to intensive drilling, attempting to restore discipline and confidence before returning to open country. Eventually, an opportunity appeared. A Lusitanian force passed near the Roman position, carrying part of the booty captured during the previous victory. Mummius waited until the moment was favorable and launched a sudden attack. This time the Romans caught their opponents unprepared. Many Lusitanians were killed, and Mummius succeeded in recovering both the stolen property and the standards that had caused Rome such embarrassment. Yet the conflict was already spreading beyond a single army. South of the Tagus, another Lusitanian force had emerged under a commander named Corcanus. These warriors attacked the Cunae, a people allied with Rome, and captured their important city of Conistorgus. Their ambitions then extended beyond the Iberian Peninsula itself. Near the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, Lusitanian forces crossed the water. Some landed in Africa and began raiding territory there, while another group attacked the city of Okel. Mummius pursued them with approximately 9,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. He caught a large number of Lusitanians while they were scattered in search of plunder and reportedly killed around 15,000 of them. He then defeated another smaller group and succeeded in lifting the siege of Osil. Soon afterward, Mummius encountered yet another band carrying captured goods. He destroyed them completely, leaving no survivor to carry news of the defeat back to their companions. The movable plunder was divided among the Roman soldiers. Whatever could not conveniently be taken away was dedicated to the gods of war and burned. After restoring Roman prestige to some extent, Mummius returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph. His successor in Spain was Marcus Attilius. Attilius immediately carried the war back into Lusitanian territory. In one campaign, he killed approximately 700 opponents and captured Oxthracae, described as their largest city. The fall of such an important settlement had a powerful psychological effect. Neighboring peoples became frightened and began negotiating submission. Even some groups among the Vetones, who lived close to the Lusitanians, accepted Roman terms. For a brief moment, the region appeared to have been pacified. But Roman control proved fragile. As soon as Attilius withdrew into winter quarters, many of the peoples who had recently surrendered revolted again. They immediately began attacking communities loyal to Rome. The next Roman commander, Servius Sulpicius Galba, moved rapidly to relieve the threatened allies. His response was extraordinarily fast. Galba reportedly marched approximately 500 stades in a single day and night, before finally coming within sight of the Lusitanian army. His speed, however, came at a cost. The Roman soldiers had been pushed to exhaustion by the forced march. Instead of allowing them time to recover, Galba ordered them into battle almost immediately. At first, the decision seemed successful. The Romans broke the Lusitanian formation and forced the enemy to retreat. Galba then repeated a mistake that had already cost other Roman commanders dearly in Spain. He pursued too aggressively. His exhausted soldiers could not maintain proper cohesion. Some moved faster than others, while many repeatedly stopped to rest. The pursuit became stretched out and disorganized. The Lusitanians noticed what was happening. Seeing the Roman army scattered across the terrain, they stopped retreating, regrouped, and suddenly attacked. The exhausted Romans were unable to respond effectively. Around 7,000 were killed. Galba escaped with the cavalrymen who remained close to him and fled to the city of Carmone. There he began gathering the survivors and calling in reinforcements. Eventually he assembled a new force of around 20,000 men. Rather than immediately returning to Lusitania, he moved into the territory of the Cunae and spent the winter at Conistorgis. Meanwhile, Lucullus was still in southern Iberia after his unauthorized campaign against the Vacae. When he discovered that Lusitanian raiding parties were operating nearby, he sent some of his most capable officers against them. Approximately 4,000 Lusitanians were killed in these operations. Lucullus later intercepted another group attempting to cross the waters near Gades and killed around 1,500 more. The survivors withdrew to high ground and took refuge on a hill. Lucullus surrounded the position completely, building a line of enclosure around them and eventually capturing a large number of warriors. He then moved directly into Lusitania and began systematically devastating the countryside. Galba attacked from another direction. Caught between Roman armies and under growing pressure, Lusitanian representatives eventually approached Galba and asked to restore the agreement they had previously made with Attilius. Galba received them warmly. He appeared not only willing to negotiate, but sympathetic to their circumstances. According to the account, he told them that he understood why they had repeatedly turned to raiding and warfare. Their country was poor, the land was difficult, and poverty had driven them into conflict. Rather than punishing them, he claimed that he wanted to solve the underlying problem. Galba offered them fertile land. He promised to relocate them to better territory, where they could establish permanent communities and live without being forced into robbery or rebellion. The proposal sounded like exactly the kind of settlement the Lusitanians had repeatedly sought from Rome. They trusted him. Families left their existing homes and gathered at the location Galba had designated. He then separated them into 3 large groups. Each group was shown an open plain and instructed to remain there until Galba returned to assign their new lands. When he approached the first group, he spoke to them as though they were already friends and allies. He told them to surrender their weapons. Believing that the agreement was genuine, they obeyed. Once they were disarmed, Roman troops surrounded them. A ditch was established around the group, preventing escape. Then Galba sent in soldiers armed with swords. The massacre began. The Lusitanians appealed desperately to the gods, reminding the Romans of the promises and guarantees they had been given. None of it mattered. The entire group was cut down. Galba then moved quickly towards the second and third groups before either could learn what had happened to the first. The same method was repeated. Promises of settlement were followed by disarmament, enclosure, and slaughter. The ancient account condemns Galba's behavior in unusually strong language. Rather than presenting the massacre as an ordinary act of warfare, it describes him as answering treachery with treachery and behaving in a way considered unworthy of Roman standards. Yet not everyone died. A small number managed to escape. Among them was a man whose name would soon become one of the most feared in Roman Spain, Viriathus. At the time, he was simply one survivor among others. Within a few years, however, he would become the central leader of Lusitanian resistance, defeat Roman armies repeatedly, and transform a scattered struggle into one of the longest and most difficult wars Rome had yet fought in the peninsula. Galba, meanwhile, profited from the massacre. Ancient tradition portrays him as even more obsessed with wealth than Lucullus. Only a small share of the captured property was distributed to his troops, another portion went to his associates, and Galba kept much of the remainder for himself, despite already being regarded as one of the wealthiest men in Rome. His reputation for dishonesty extended beyond warfare. Even in peaceful circumstances, he was accused of lying and violating promises whenever financial profit was involved. The massacre made him deeply unpopular, and formal accusations were eventually brought against him. Yet Galba escaped punishment. His wealth and influence protected him. The killings did not end resistance. They produced the opposite result. Not long afterwards, survivors of the betrayals associated with Lucullus and Galba gathered together. Around 10,000 men eventually formed a new force and began raiding Turdetania. Rome responded by sending Gaius Vitellius with another army. Vitellius combined fresh troops sent from Italy with Roman soldiers already serving in Spain, giving him a force of roughly 10,000 men. He initially performed well. Roman troops attacked Lusitanian foragers and killed many of them. The remainder were gradually forced into an extremely dangerous position. If they stayed where they were, they faced starvation. If they attempted to leave, the Romans could destroy them. With no obvious military solution, the trapped Lusitanians again attempted negotiation. Representatives carrying olive branches approached Vitellius and asked for land where their people could settle permanently. In return, they offered to accept Roman authority and obey Rome from that point onward. Vitellius agreed. A settlement appeared to be taking shape. For many Lusitanians, the offer must have sounded familiar. Once again, Rome was promising land in exchange for submission. But Viriathus was among them. He remembered Galba. He reminded the assembled warriors of the promises Rome had made before and how those promises had ended in massacre. He spoke of broken oaths, violated agreements, and the fate of men who had trusted Roman guarantees. The army surrounding him was itself evidence of those betrayals. Many of the warriors standing there had survived the treachery of Galba or Lucullus. Viriathus argued that surrender would simply expose them to another disaster. But he also offered an alternative. If they trusted him, he promised that he could lead them out of the trap. His confidence gave them new hope. The warriors chose Viriathus as their commander. His first major action as leader demonstrated the qualities that would define his entire war against Rome. Instead of attempting to defeat Vitellius through a conventional battle, Viriathus relied on speed, deception, timing, and knowledge of the terrain. He arranged the entire Lusitanian force in battle formation, creating the impression that he intended to fight the Romans directly. But his real plan was completely different. He secretly instructed the majority of the army that the moment he mounted his horse, they were to break formation and scatter in every direction. They were not to flee together. Each group was to take a different route and make its own way towards the city of Tribala. Once there, they would regroup and wait for him. Viriathus kept only 1,000 warriors with him. Then he mounted his horse. Immediately the Lusitanian army dissolved. Thousands of men scattered across the countryside in separate directions. Vitellius now faced a difficult decision. Pursuing the fugitives meant dividing his own army into numerous detachments across unfamiliar terrain. Instead, he concentrated on the smaller force that remained behind with Viriathus. The Roman commander assumed that this was the group he could destroy. But Viriathus had no intention of fighting a decisive battle. His cavalry possessed fast, agile horses, and he used them to keep the Romans constantly occupied. He charged toward them, then withdrew. He approached again, stopped, threatened another attack, and pulled away once more. Whenever the Romans attempted to close the distance, he escaped. Whenever they began to relax, he returned. This continued throughout the entire day. Then it continued into the following day. Viriathus was not trying to defeat the Roman army. He was buying time. Every hour that Vitellius remained focused on him allowed thousands of Lusitanians to travel farther toward safety. Once Viriathus judged that the scattered groups had been given enough time to escape, his task was complete. Under cover of darkness, he abandoned the battlefield. Rather than taking the most direct route, he moved through difficult and indirect paths known to his men. His lighter equipment, superior horses, and familiarity with the landscape allowed him to travel much faster than the Romans. Vitellius could not keep up. Roman soldiers were burdened by heavy armor. Their cavalry horses were slower, and they lacked detailed knowledge of the local roads and tracks. Viriathus reached Tribala safely. There he reunited with the warriors he had sent ahead. An army that had seemed trapped between starvation and surrender had escaped almost intact. The achievement immediately spread Viriathus's reputation throughout the surrounding regions. He had done more than save his men. He had shown that Roman armies could be manipulated, delayed, and outmaneuvered without confronting them directly in the kind of battle Rome preferred. Warriors from neighboring communities began joining him. Reinforcements arrived from different parts of the region. The survivor of Galba's massacre was becoming the leader of a much broader resistance. The struggle that followed would continue for 8 years. During that time, Viriathus would repeatedly frustrate Roman commanders, exploit the difficult landscape of western Iberia, destroy or outmaneuver larger armies, and force Rome to devote increasing attention to a war it had repeatedly expected to end quickly. His rise also represented something deeper. The violence and broken agreements of earlier Roman commanders had helped create the very enemy Rome now had to fight. The massacres intended to eliminate resistance had instead produced survivors with powerful reasons to distrust every Roman offer of peace. Among those survivors, Viriathus proved uniquely capable of transforming memory, anger, and desperation into military organization. The Lusitanian War was entering a new phase. From this point onward, Rome would no longer be dealing simply with scattered raiding bands or temporary rebellions. It would be confronting Viriathus. From this point onward, the war against Viriathus became so difficult and exhausting for Rome that it deserves to be followed as a separate story. Other events taking place in Spain at the same time can be left aside for the moment. because the struggle against the Lusitanian leader developed into one of the most persistent challenges Roman commanders had yet faced in the peninsula. Vitellius continued pursuing Viriathus until the Lusitanians reached the region around Tribala. Viriathus, however, had already prepared the ground for another ambush. Part of his force was concealed in thick woodland, while the rest continued retreating, deliberately giving the impression that they were still trying to escape. Vitellius followed them without realizing what was waiting ahead. Once the Roman column had moved past the hidden warriors, Viriathus suddenly turned back and attacked, while the men concealed in the forest rushed out against the Romans from another direction. The Roman formation collapsed under the surprise assault. Men were killed in large numbers, driven toward steep cliffs, or captured while attempting to escape. Vitellius himself was among those taken prisoner. The Lusitanian who captured him did not realize that the elderly and heavily built man before him was the Roman commander. Believing him to be an insignificant prisoner of little value, he simply killed him. The rest of the Roman army suffered badly. Of approximately 10,000 soldiers, only around 6,000 managed to reach the coastal city of Carpessus. Ancient tradition associated this settlement with the famous Tartessus of earlier Greek accounts, once ruled by the legendary King Arganthonius. The Roman survivors who reached Carpessus were deeply demoralized. The quaestor who had accompanied Vitellius placed them on the city walls rather than immediately sending them back into the field. Hoping to continue resistance through allied forces, he requested soldiers from the Belli and Titi and received around 5,000 men. These were sent against Viriathus, but the attempt ended in another disaster. Viriathus completely destroyed the allied force, leaving no survivors to return with news of what had happened. After such a defeat, the quaestor remained inside the city and waited for additional support from Rome. Viriathus now enjoyed considerable freedom of movement. He entered the fertile lands of Carpetania and devastated the countryside without serious opposition. Rome eventually sent Gaius Plautius with a new force of around 10,000 infantry and 1,300 cavalry. Viriathus once again relied on deception rather than straightforward confrontation. He pretended to retreat, encouraging Plautius to send approximately 4,000 soldiers after him. Once the pursuing Romans had been drawn far enough away from the main force, Viriathus suddenly turned and attacked them. Almost the entire detachment was destroyed. After this victory, Viriathus crossed the Tagus and established himself on a mountain covered with olive trees, known as the Mountain of Venus. Plautius followed him there, determined to repair the damage to his reputation. Instead, he suffered another defeat. The Romans lost heavily, and Plautius withdrew in disorder towards the towns. His confidence was so badly shaken that he went into winter quarters while it was still the middle of summer and refused to expose his army to further major operations. With the Romans largely inactive, Viriathus moved freely through the surrounding territory. Landowners were forced either to pay him the value of their crops or watch those crops be destroyed. The situation finally became serious enough for Rome to send Fabius Maximus Aemilianus, the son of the famous Aemilius Paulus, who had defeated King Perseus of Macedon. Rome had recently emerged from major wars in Carthage, Greece, and Macedonia, and Maximus did not want to exhaust soldiers who had only recently returned from those campaigns. Instead, he raised 2 legions largely composed of young men without previous battlefield experience. Additional allied troops were added, giving him approximately 15,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry when he reached Orso in Spain. Maximus understood that inexperienced troops should not be thrown immediately against a commander as dangerous as Viriathus. Rather than seeking an early decisive battle, he concentrated on training and discipline. He even traveled through the straits to Gades to perform sacrifices to Hercules. During his absence, Viriathus attacked Roman woodcutters, killing many and terrifying the rest. A Roman officer came out to confront him but was defeated as well, allowing the Lusitanians to seize substantial booty. When Maximus returned, Viriathus repeatedly drew up his forces and challenged him to battle. Maximus refused to be provoked. He continued training his army while using smaller engagements to test both the strength of the enemy and the confidence of his own men. Whenever unarmed soldiers were sent out to gather provisions, he surrounded them with armed legionaries for protection. He personally patrolled the surrounding countryside with his cavalry, following methods he had observed from his father during the Macedonian campaigns. By the end of the winter, Maximus believed that his army was finally ready. He moved against Viriathus and became one of the few Roman commanders able to force him into retreat. Viriathus still resisted fiercely, but Maximus captured 2 of his cities, plundering one and burning the other. He pursued the Lusitanian leader as far as a place called Baker and killed many of his followers before eventually establishing winter quarters at Corduba. After completing his period of command, Maximus returned to Rome and was replaced by Quintus Pompeius Aulus. Viriathus had now learned that not every Roman commander could be treated with contempt. Rather than relying entirely on direct operations against Roman armies, he widened the conflict politically. He persuaded the Arevaci, Titi, and Belli, all formidable peoples of central Spain, to abandon their allegiance to Rome. These communities then began a separate struggle that became known as the Numantine War, named after the city of Numantia. This new conflict would prove long, frustrating, and extremely costly for Rome. At the same time, Viriathus continued operating in western Spain. He fought another Roman commander named Quintius, and initially suffered a defeat, forcing him back toward the Mountain of Venus. But the setback did not last. Viriathus soon descended from the mountain, attacked the Romans, killed around 1,000 men, captured military standards, and forced the survivors back into their camp. He also drove the Roman garrison from Ituca and began devastating the territory of the Bastitani. Quintius lacked both experience and confidence. Instead of vigorously defending the threatened regions, he withdrew to Corduba in the middle of autumn and entered winter quarters. From there, he frequently sent Gaius Marcius, a Spaniard from Italica, to conduct operations against Viriathus. Rome was still struggling to find a commander capable of permanently breaking Lusitanian resistance. At the end of the year, Quintius was replaced by Fabius Maximus Servilianus, the brother of Maximus Aemilianus. Servilianus brought 2 new legions from Rome, as well as allied troops, giving him a force of roughly 18,000 infantry and 1,600 cavalry. He also contacted Micipsa, king of Numidia, requesting elephants as quickly as possible. As Servilianus advanced toward Ituca with his forces moving in separate divisions, Viriathus suddenly appeared with around 6,000 warriors. The Lusitanians rushed forward with loud cries and terrifying battle noise, their long hair moving dramatically as they charged, a practice intended to intimidate their opponents. Servilianus did not panic. He maintained his position, resisted the attack, and forced Viriathus to withdraw without achieving anything decisive. The balance changed after the rest of the Roman army arrived, along with 10 elephants and 300 African cavalry. Servilianus concentrated his troops, established a large camp, and moved aggressively against Viriathus. This time the Romans defeated him and began pursuing his retreating army. Once again, however, Roman success led to overconfidence. The pursuit became disorganized as soldiers lost formation while chasing the enemy. Viriathus immediately recognized the mistake. He stopped retreating, rallied his men, and counterattacked. Around 3,000 Romans were killed, and the survivors were driven back toward their camp. Viriathus even attacked the Roman defenses. Panic spread among the soldiers, many of whom hid inside their tents instead of defending the entrances. Servilianus and his tribunes struggled to force the frightened men back into position. During the fighting, Fannius, a relative by marriage of the prominent Roman Laelius, distinguished himself through exceptional bravery. The Romans managed to hold out until nightfall, which finally brought the attack to an end. Viriathus did not abandon the pressure. He continued appearing unexpectedly at night or during the hottest hours of the day, using lightly armed troops and fast horses to harass Roman positions whenever Servilianus least expected him. These repeated attacks eventually forced the Roman commander to retreat toward Ituca. Viriathus, however, was also beginning to suffer from shortages. His army had declined in numbers, and provisions were becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. He therefore burned his camp during the night and withdrew into Lusitania. Servilianus failed to catch him, and instead turned against areas that had supported the Lusitanian cause. He entered Boeotia and plundered 5 towns that had sided with Viriathus before marching against the Cunae and then returning once again toward Lusitania. During these operations, 2 independent raiding leaders named Curius and Apuleius attacked the Roman army with around 10,000 men. Their sudden assault caused confusion and allowed them to capture Roman booty. Curius was killed during the fighting, however, and Servilianus soon recovered what had been taken. He then captured several settlements associated with Viriathus, including Escardia, Gemella, and Obolcola. Some towns were plundered, while others were spared depending on the circumstances of their surrender. Servilianus captured approximately 10,000 prisoners during this stage of the campaign. His treatment of them was severe. Around 500 were executed by beheading, while the remainder were sold into slavery. Another leader named Conoba surrendered voluntarily. Servilianus spared Conoba personally, but ordered the hands of all his followers to be cut off. Such punishments were intended not only to weaken resistance, but also to terrorize other communities considering rebellion. Continuing his pursuit of Viriathus, Servilianus eventually surrounded Erisana, one of the towns associated with the Lusitanian leader. Viriathus secretly entered the city during the night. At dawn, he launched a sudden attack against Roman soldiers working in the siege trenches. The workers were forced to abandon their tools and flee. Viriathus then turned against the main Roman army, which Servilianus had drawn up for battle, defeated it, and began a relentless pursuit. The Romans were driven toward a position beneath steep cliffs, where escape became almost impossible. Servilianus and his army were now trapped. Viriathus had achieved an extraordinary advantage and could potentially have destroyed a large Roman force. Instead of using the opportunity for complete revenge, he chose negotiation. Viriathus believed that a dramatic act of moderation might finally bring the long war to an end. He offered terms rather than slaughtering the trapped Romans. An agreement was reached and later formally approved by the Roman people. Under its terms, Viriathus was officially recognized as a friend of Rome, while his followers were allowed to retain the lands they already occupied. After years of defeats, ambushes, raids, Roman reinforcements, and repeated campaigns, the war appeared finally to have ended. Viriathus had forced Rome not merely to negotiate, but to recognize him politically. The settlement represented one of the greatest achievements of his career. Yet the peace survived only briefly. Servilianus was replaced by his brother, Quintus Servilius Caepio. Caepio strongly opposed the agreement and regarded it as humiliating to Roman prestige. He repeatedly wrote to the Senate arguing that Rome should not accept such terms with Viriathus. At first, the Senate allowed him only to undermine the Lusitanian leader quietly and unofficially. Caepio continued complaining and sending letters until the Senate finally changed its position and authorized the renewal of open war. Once hostilities resumed, Caepio captured the town of Arsa, which Viriathus abandoned before the Romans could trap him. The Roman commander then pursued him into Carpetania. Caepio possessed a much larger army, and Viriathus understood that a direct battle would be unnecessarily dangerous. He therefore repeated a tactic that had served him well throughout the war. Most of his soldiers were secretly sent away through a concealed passage, while Viriathus remained behind with a smaller force positioned visibly on high ground. To the Romans, it appeared that he was preparing to fight. Once he judged that the main body of his army had reached safety, Viriathus suddenly withdrew at extraordinary speed. By the time the Romans realized what had happened, he had disappeared. Caepio was unable to determine where he had gone, and instead turned against the Vetones and Calaici, devastating their countryside. The example of Viriathus had meanwhile inspired numerous other armed groups. independent bands began conducting raids throughout Lusitania, imitating the mobile style of warfare that had made him so successful. Rome sent Sextus Junius Brutus to deal with them, but he quickly recognized how difficult the task would be. The region was enormous and broken by major rivers such as the Tagus, Lethe, Durius, and Baetis. The raiders moved rapidly through the countryside and avoided conventional battle. Chasing them endlessly offered little chance of success, yet allowing them to continue operating would be humiliating. Even defeating small bands of raiders would bring little prestige to a Roman commander. Brutus therefore changed strategy. Instead of chasing the mobile forces directly, he began attacking their towns and settlements. By threatening their homes, he hoped to force the raiders to abandon the countryside and return to defend their communities. At the same time, the destruction of towns offered substantial opportunities for plunder. His campaign became extremely destructive. Settlements encountered along the route were attacked and devastated. Women fought beside the men in many communities and, according to the account, often died alongside them without showing fear or crying out. Other inhabitants escaped into mountainous regions carrying whatever possessions they could save. When some later approached Brutus asking for mercy, he accepted their surrender and redistributed part of their property. Brutus continued northward and crossed the Durius, extending Roman operations into regions that had previously seen little direct Roman military activity. He demanded hostages from communities that submitted and eventually reached the river Lethe. The river carried a powerful reputation in ancient imagination, but Brutus became the first Roman commander recorded as deliberately crossing it during these campaigns. Beyond the Lethe, he reached another river called the Nimis, where he encountered the Bracari. They had attacked his supply train, and Brutus responded aggressively. The Bracari were considered exceptionally warlike, and their women fought alongside the men. The account emphasizes their determination, describing warriors who preferred death to retreat and refused to turn their backs even when defeat became unavoidable. The women were portrayed as equally determined. Some who were captured reportedly killed themselves, while others even killed their own children rather than allow them to live as prisoners. Several towns eventually surrendered to Brutus, but later revolted when the immediate Roman pressure disappeared. He was therefore forced to return and subdue them again. One of the most troublesome settlements was Talabriga. The city repeatedly surrendered and then rebelled whenever Roman control weakened. When Brutus finally marched against it again, the inhabitants followed their usual pattern and asked for forgiveness, agreeing to submit without conditions. Brutus demanded that they surrender deserters, prisoners, weapons, and hostages. After these demands were met, he ordered the entire population to leave the city together with their wives and children. Once they had assembled outside, Roman troops surrounded them. The inhabitants believed that a massacre was about to begin. Brutus addressed them directly and reminded them of how many times they had broken agreements, rebelled, and forced Rome to return against them. He deliberately allowed their fear to grow, making them believe that severe punishment was unavoidable. But he stopped after the warning. Instead of killing them, Brutus confiscated their horses, provisions, public funds, and other communal resources. He then allowed the inhabitants to return to Talabriga and continue living there. The decision surprised them, since they had expected a fate far worse than financial and military disarmament. After completing these operations, Brutus eventually returned to Rome. His campaigns are closely connected with the history of Viriathus, because many of the guerrilla groups Brutus fought had emerged during the same period and had been inspired by the Lusitanian leaders' success against Roman armies. Meanwhile, Viriathus himself continued looking for a way to end the war. He sent 3 of his most trusted companions, Audax, Ditalco, and Minurus, to Caepio in order to discuss terms of peace. Caepio saw a different opportunity. Instead of negotiating honestly, he offered the 3 men substantial rewards and promises if they would murder their own commander. They accepted. Viriathus lived under constant pressure and rarely enjoyed uninterrupted sleep. Years of fighting had made caution part of his daily routine. He often rested while still wearing his armor so that he could immediately respond if danger appeared. His closest companions were therefore allowed to enter his tent even during the night, since military emergencies could arise at any moment. Audax, Ditalco, and Menurus used this trust against him. They waited until Viriathus had fallen asleep, and then entered his tent as though they had urgent business to discuss. Because much of his body remained protected by armor even while he rested, they struck him in the throat, the one vulnerable area that remained exposed. The attack was precise. Viriathus died without raising an alarm. The assassins escaped from the camp and returned to Caepio, expecting the remainder of the reward they had been promised. Caepio allowed them to keep what they had already received, but when they requested further payment, he refused to settle the matter himself and directed them toward Rome. Back in the Lusitanian camp, no one immediately understood what had happened. Viriathus was known for sleeping very little, so his attendants became increasingly surprised when he failed to appear after such an unusually long period of rest. Eventually, someone entered the tent. They found him lying dead, still dressed in his armor. Grief immediately spread throughout the army. The soldiers mourned not only the loss of their commander, but also the uncertainty that followed his death. They understood how dangerous their position had become without the man who had repeatedly saved them from Roman armies. Their frustration was intensified by the fact that the killers had already escaped, leaving the warriors unable to punish those responsible. Viriathus was given an elaborate funeral. His body was dressed in magnificent clothing and placed upon a large funeral pyre. Numerous sacrifices were offered in his honor. Armed infantry and cavalry moved around the burning pyre in groups, praising their fallen leader according to their own customs. The warriors remained gathered around the fire until it had completely burned out. Afterward, combat contests were held near his tomb as part of the funeral ceremonies. The depth of the mourning reflected the extraordinary loyalty Viriathus had inspired. Ancient accounts describe him as an exceptional commander who consistently placed himself in danger alongside his men. He was also remembered for distributing captured property fairly. Although his followers repeatedly encouraged him to take a larger share of the spoils because of his position as leader, he refused. Even the portion he did accept was frequently redistributed among those who had shown the greatest courage. This behavior helped him accomplish something extremely difficult. His army contained warriors from different tribes and communities, yet throughout approximately 8 years of warfare, it avoided the serious internal rebellions and divisions that often destroyed coalition armies. His soldiers remained loyal, followed his commands, and continued risking their lives under his leadership. After his death, command passed to a man named Tantalus. The new leader attempted to continue the struggle and launched an expedition toward Saguntum. The attack failed, and the Lusitanians were forced to retreat. As they attempted to cross the Baetis, Caepio pursued them relentlessly. Tantalus eventually recognized that continued resistance was impossible. Exhausted and under constant pressure, he surrendered both himself and his army to Caepio on the condition that they would be treated as Roman subjects rather than destroyed. Caepio accepted. The Lusitanians were disarmed, but instead of being massacred, they were given enough land to support themselves. The intention was to remove one of the central causes that had repeatedly pushed poorer communities toward raiding and rebellion. With the surrender of Tantalus and the settlement of his followers, the long war associated with Viriathus finally came to an end. Rome had ultimately survived the conflict, but victory had required years of campaigns, enormous losses, repeated changes of commanders, diplomatic reversals, and eventually the assassination of the one man Roman armies had never been able to permanently defeat in the field. Viriathus had begun as one of the survivors of Galba's massacre. From that beginning, he had risen to command a coalition capable of repeatedly defeating Roman armies, forcing Roman commanders into humiliating retreats, inspiring resistance across western Iberia, and even compelling Rome for a brief period to recognize him formally as a friend and political equal. His death removed the leader around whom that resistance had been built, but the larger Spanish wars were not over. While the struggle against Viriathus was reaching its violent conclusion, another conflict was already growing farther east around Numantia. The Arevaci, Belli, and Titi had returned to war, and Rome was about to discover that defeating one extraordinary opponent did not mean that the resistance of